The scratch of the quills stopped. Crisp Gascoyne did not look up immediately. He let the silence stretch, a thin wire pulled taut between his desk and the door, listening to the wet, rhythmic dripping of melting frost from the window ledge onto the stone sill below. Drip, drip, a slow erosion. Then he lifted his gaze, the watery grey irises struggling to find focus against the gloom of the January afternoon. "Leave it," he said. His voice came out low, a gravelly rumble that seemed to cost him effort, as if the words had to be dragged up from the bottom of a well. The clerk, a man whose spine had curved permanently towards the ledger books over 40 years of service, hesitated. The parchment lay on the oak desk, a stark white rectangle in the dim room. It bore the name Elizabeth Canning in a hand that shook slightly, the ink still glistening wetly where the final full stop had been pressed too hard. "My lord," the clerk murmured, not moving his feet. "The constable waits in the yard. He says the girl is diminished." Gascoyne reached for the paper. His fingers, pale and fleshy, trembled just enough to make the silver ring on his little finger catch the candlelight. He pulled the deposition closer. The smell of it hit him first, and not the dry dust of old legal briefs he was accustomed to, but the sharp, sour tang of unwashed wool and stale hunger that seemed to have soaked into the very fibers of the sheet during its journey from Aldermanbury. He could almost smell the cold on it. "Diminished is a condition, not a charge, Mr. Halloway," Gascoyne said, adjusting the heavy black broadcloth of his sleeve where it had bunched at the wrist. "Read the facts, not the sympathies." Halloway shifted his weight, the leather of his shoes squeaking against the floorboards as he spoke. "She claims confinement, my lord. 7 weeks without food," she said, locked away in a loft in Enfield Wash. Gascoyne scanned the lines. The script was jagged, hurried, taken, dragged, thrown down, the words piled up like stones in a riverbed, obstructing the flow of logic. He felt the familiar itch start at the base of his skull, right where the horsehair of his full-bottomed wig dug into the soft flesh of his neck. He wanted to claw at it, to tear the thing off and throw it into the fire, but he sat rigid, his hands clasped tight over the desk to stop them from fidgeting. "And the captors?" Gascoyne asked, his eyes skipping over the emotional flourishes to hunt for names, dates, specifics. "A woman named Wells, and a gypsy, Mary Squires." The name Squires landed on the desk like a dropped coin. Gascoyne flinched, a tiny, almost imperceptible wrinkle of the shoulders. Gypsies, itinerants. The city hated them with a hunger that rivaled any starvation the girl might have suffered. To accuse a Squires was to light a fuse in a powder keg. He knew the streets already. He could hear them without opening the window. The low murmur of the crowd gathering outside the mansion house was not a roar yet, but a hum, a vibration that traveled up through the soles of his shoes and settled in his bad leg. His left foot, twisted and knotted by years of gout, gave a sudden, sharp throb against the floorboard. He gritted his teeth, pressing the heel down harder as if he could crush the pain into submission. It was a useless gesture. The pain was a tenant that never moved out, only demanded higher rent when the damp set in. "If this is true," Gascoyne said, speaking more to the frost-patterned glass than to the clerk, "then we have a crime of monstrous proportion. If it is false." He trailed off. The sentence hung there, unfinished, dangerous. To suggest falsehood now with the city holding its breath was to invite chaos. He remembered the last time, the face of the boy in 49 pale on the scaffold, the eyes wide and accusing even after the drop. Gascoyne had signed that warrant too. He had told himself the evidence was sufficient, the law clear, but the silence of the grave was louder than any courtroom objection, and it had followed him home every night since. "My lord," Halloway prompted, sensing the hesitation. "Shall I instruct the constable to bring her in, or do we issue a warrant for the women first?" Gascoyne picked up his quill. The feather felt brittle, ready to snap. He dipped it into the inkwell, watching the black liquid coat the nib. He needed to write. He needed to authorize the inquiry, to set the machinery of the law in motion so that he would not be the one holding the weight of it alone. The corporation expected order. Fielding would expect decisive action. Henry was already likely drafting a pamphlet in his head, turning this tragedy into a moral fable about the dangers of the outskirts. "Just sign it," the voice in his head whispered. "Let the magistrates at the next level sort the truth. You are the Lord Mayor, not a nursemaid." He brought the quill to the paper. The tip hovered over the space reserved for his signature. Outside, the murmur rose. A shout, indistinct but sharp, cut through the muffled glass. Then another, the sound of boots scuffing on the cobbles, a shuffling mass of humanity pressing closer to the doors. They knew, of course they knew. In London, news travelled faster than the post, carried on the backs of beggars, and the breath of gossips before the ink was even dry on a deposition. Gascoyne's hands stalled. The quill trembled, depositing a single fat drop of ink onto the parchment. It bloomed there, a dark, ugly star obscuring the date. "My lord, the ink," Holloway said, leaning forward. "Wait," Gascoyne snapped. The word came out sharper than he intended, cracking like a whip in the small room. He saw the clerk recoil, eyes widening slightly before dropping to the floor. Gascoyne breathed in. The air tasted of tallow smoke and the metallic bite of the coming night. He looked at the ink stain. It looked like a bruise. He thought of Mary Squires, a woman he had never met, already condemned in the minds of every tradesman from Cheapside to Shoreditch simply by the sound of her name. He thought of the girl, Canning, shivering in some corner of the city, her story a weapon that could kill as surely as a pistol. He wanted to be done. He wanted to close the book, extinguish the candles, and retreat to the warmth of his private chambers, where the only demand on him was the ache in his joints. He wanted the quiet, but the quiet was a lie. The quiet was what happened before the storm broke. "Tell the constable," Gascoyne said, his voice dropping back to that forced, gravelly calm, "to hold the girl in the wardroom. Do not bring her to me yet. I require a moment to consider the jurisdiction." "Jurisdiction, my lord," Holloway frowned, the confusion plain on his thin face. "She is within the city liberties. The matter is ours." "Is it?" Gascoyne muttered, more to himself. "Or does it belong to the mob waiting in the yard?" He pushed the paper away. The movement was abrupt, knocking the inkwell slightly so that it rattled against the wood. He could not sign, not yet. To sign was to accept the narrative, to step onto the path that Fielding had already paved. And if the path led to a cliff? Holloway opened his mouth to argue, to cite precedent or procedure, but a new sound drowned him out. Thud. It was heavy, dull, and unmistakable. Something had struck the great oak doors of the mansion house, not a knock, a blow. Thud crash. Followed by the roar. It wasn't a cheer. It was a demand, a single guttural sound made by hundreds of throats acting as one lung. Blood. They were already calling for it. They had decided the guilt before the first witness had sworn an oath. Gascoyne stared at the door. The wood groaned under the pressure. He felt the vibration of it in the desk, traveling up his arms, settling in his chest. He reached for his spectacles, though his vision was clear, his fingers already pulling the handkerchief from his pocket to wipe lenses that were spotless. "Holloway," he said, his eyes fixed on the door as another stone slammed against it, shaking the frame. "Lock the inner bolt." The clerk scrambled backward, face pale. "My lord, they cannot." "They can," Gascoyne whispered, folding the linen over and over with trembling precision. "And they will." Holloway's hand shook so violently the key rattled against the iron plate, a high, thin chime that cut through the low-frequency rumble of the crowd outside. He fumbled, the metal slipping from his sweating palm to clatter on the floorboards, and he dropped to his knees with a haste that looked like prayer but was pure terror. "Leave it," Gascoyne said. Words fell flat, useless against the din. The door shuddered again, a heavy shoulder of timber groaning as the wood fibers stretched to their limit. Dust sifted down from the lintel, settling on the black broadcloth of Gascoyne's coat, fine grey powder on dark wool. He did not brush it away. He watched the linen in his hands, the white square becoming a twisted rope as his fingers worked the fabric, folding, creasing, smoothing, folding again, until the material was hot from the friction of his own skin. Scrape, thud, roar. The rhythm was irregular, a heartbeat skipping under fever. Somewhere out there in the frozen yard, a boot connected with the lower panel. The sound was wet, splintering, distinct from the dull thump of a fist or a stone. They were trying to break in, not to petition, not to plead, to take. "My lord, the bolt," Holloway gasped from the floor, still on his knees, one hand clutching the key as if it were a holy relic. "If they breach the outerer." Let them break the wood, Gascoyne said, his voice dropping into that gravelly register that forced the clerk to stop breathing and listen. They will not break the law, not while I sit in this chair. He lied, he knew he lied. The law was a fragile thing, constructed of ink and precedent, and the collective agreement of men to pretend that words held more weight than fists. Out there, the agreement had dissolved. The collective had become a single organism with 100 eyes and a mouth full of broken teeth, and it wanted the blood of a gypsy woman it had never seen, for a crime it did not understand, based on the word of a girl whose eyes held a hunger that looked too much like calculation. Gascoyne stood up. The movement sent a spike of white-hot fire through his left foot, the gout flaring in the big toe as if a red-hot nail had been driven through the joint. He gripped the edge of the desk, knuckles whitening, the silver head of his cane cold against his other hand. He did not make a sound. Pain was a private currency. He would not spend it in front of Holloway. "Stand up, man," he ordered, not looking at the clerk. "You look like a penitent before a bishop. There is no absolution here." Holloway scrambled to his feet, brushing dust from his breeches, his face the color of curdled milk. "Shall I call the guard, the watch? They are stationed at the Guildhall, a mere 5 minutessa. And by the time they arrive, the room will be overturned and we will be hanging from the rafters," Gascoyne snapped. He turned finally, fixing the clerk with a stare that was meant to be steady but felt brittle, like ice over a deep river. "Do nothing, say nothing. If they enter, you will stand behind me and you will keep your mouth shut unless I ask you a direct question. Is that understood?" "Yes, my lord." Holloway's voice was a squeak. "But the warrant, sir, the deposition, if they see it unsigned." Gascoyne looked down at the desk. The ink stain had spread, the edges feathering out into the grain of the oak, a dark bruise blooming across the date. It looked like an accusation. "You hesitated." The quill lay beside it, the feather still wet, the nib gleaming in the candlelight. A simple stroke, that was all it took. One curve of the G, one loop of the Y, Crisp Gascoyne, Lord Mayor, the authority of the city. With that signature, he could send the constables out to drag Mary Squires from whatever hovel she occupied, to chain her, to try her, to hang her. Or he could withhold it, and the mob outside would tear the building apart to find her anyway, dragging her out by her hair to hang her from the nearest lamp post without the benefit of a trial, without the benefit of God. Damn Fielding, damn the man and his pamphlets and his certainties. Henry would have signed it already. Henry would be out there now, standing on the steps, booming his voice, turning the chaos into a narrative, making the bloodshed feel like justice. Henry did not lie awake at night, seeing the face of a boy who had died for a theft he did not commit. Henry did not hear the silence of the grave. "Give me the paper," Gascoyne said. Holloway hesitated, then slid the parchment forward. The sound of the paper dragging on the wood was loud, a dry rasp. Gascoyne picked up the quill. His hand was steady now. The tremor had moved inward, settling in his chest, leaving his extremities cold and precise. He hovered the nib over the blank space below the text. The ink well weighted. All he had to do was dip. Crash! The outer door gave way, not with a splintering crack, but a sudden hollow boom as the latch tore free from the frame. A wave of sound pressed against the inner door, making the wood bulge inward as the roar of the crowd surged into the antechamber. Screams rose now, individual voices cutting above the general din to shout "Squires" and "Witch," before demanding "Hang her" and "Canning." They were chanting names, a litany of hate. Gascoyne lowered the quill. He did not sign. He placed the feather back in the stand, aligning it perfectly parallel to the edge of the desk. "Holloway," he said, his voice quiet, almost gentle, "blow out the candles." "My lord," the clerk blinked, confused, his eyes darting between the door and the master. "In the dark, they will see the light from the crack, sir." "Blow them out," Gascoyne repeated. "All of them, leave only the hearth." Holloway moved quickly, snuffing the wicks with his fingers, plunging the room into a gloom illuminated only by the dying embers of the fire and the thin grey light filtering through the frost-patterned windows. The shadows lengthened, stretching across the floor, merging with the darkness under the desk. The room felt smaller, colder. The smell of extinguished wick, acrid and sulphurous, mixed with the scent of damp wool and old paper. Gascoyne sat back down. He folded the handkerchief one last time, a small, tight square, and placed it in his pocket. He rested his hands on the desk, palms flat, feeling the vibration of the crowd through the wood. They were battering the inner door now. The wood screamed. The bolt held for a second, for another, but the metal was bending. He closed his eyes. He did not pray. He simply waited for the wood to fail, for the door to fly open, for the cold air and the hot breath of the city to rush in and demand its sacrifice. He thought of Mary Squires, somewhere in the dark, perhaps sleeping, perhaps praying to a god that did not listen to gypsies. He thought of Elizabeth Canning, shivering in a wardroom, her story a shield that was already cracking. And he thought of himself, sitting in the dark, hiding from the very people he was sworn to protect, waiting for the moment when he would have to choose between the law and the life of the man who wrote it. The bolt shrieked. A sliver of light appeared at the edge of the door frame, narrow and bright as a knife blade. Then another. The wood began to splinter, long shards peeling away like bark from a storm-broken tree. Gascoyne opened his eyes. He stared at the sliver of light, at the dust motes dancing in it, and he waited for the world to end. The door did not open. It exploded inward. A gust of January air, sharp with coal smoke, and the sour tang of unwashed bodies, rushed into the dim room, snuffing the last of the hearth's warmth before the latch even finished its violent rattling against the wainscot. Henry Fielding filled the doorway, a mountain of a man draped in heavy wool that seemed to absorb the grey light rather than reflect it. His face flushed a deep, feverish crimson from the cold and the exertion of forcing his way through the corridor. He did not apologize for the intrusion, nor did he acknowledge the darkness in which Gascoyne sat, his hands still flat on the desk, palms pressed against the grain as if trying to hold the building together by sheer friction. Light, Fielding barked, the word booming off the panelled walls, scattering the dust motes that had been dancing in the sliver of light from the splintered door. For God's sake, Crisp, put a candle to it. We are not conspirators in a cellar. Halloway scrambled from the shadows, his face pale and drawn, striking flint against steel with trembling fingers until a single taper caught, casting long, jerking shadows that made Fielding's bulk seem to swell and shrink against the bookshelves. The magistrate strode forward, his cane thumping a heavy, irregular rhythm on the floorboards, a sound that echoed the frantic beating of Gascoyne's own heart, though the Lord Mayor kept his expression fixed, a mask of sober exactitude that felt increasingly fragile against the force of the other man's presence. Fielding reached the desk and slammed a sheaf of papers down beside the inkwell, the impact sending a small ripple through the black liquid, threatening to spill it across the commitment warrant Gascoyne had refused to sign. A clear state of the case of Elizabeth Canning. The title stared up from the top sheet, printed in bold, accusatory type that seemed to vibrate with the certainty of a verdict already delivered in the court of public opinion. "You sit here in the gloom while the city burns," Fielding said, his voice dropping to a low, gravelly register that forced Gascoyne to lean forward, creating an intimacy that felt less like confidence and more like a threat. "Do you hear them out there? They are not asking for justice, Crisp. They are demanding it, and if we do not give it to them in the form of law, they will take it in the form of blood." Gascoyne adjusted his wig, the heavy full-bottomed curls scratching against his neck, a physical burden that mirrored the weight settling in his chest. He looked at the pamphlet, then at Fielding's eyes, which burned with a terrifying conviction, a kind of intellectual fervor that left no room for the grey areas where doubt usually lived. "I hear them, Henry," Gascoyne replied, his own voice dry, devoid of the rhetorical flourish that came so naturally to the author of Tom Jones. "I have been hearing them since dawn, but noise is not evidence. A clamour does not constitute a deposition." Fielding laughed, a short, sharp bark that held no humour. He leaned over the desk, bracing his weight on his good leg, his face inches from Gascoyne's. The smell of brandy and wet wool clung to him, overpowering the scent of the extinguished candles. "Evidence?" Fielding scoffed, waving a hand towards the window where the roar of the mob still pressed against the glass, a constant, low-frequency thrum that vibrated in the teeth. "Look at the girl, Crisp. Have you seen her? She is a skeleton wrapped in rags, starving in a city of plenty. She walked half-frozen miles to return to her master's house. Does that sound like the fabrication of a cunning liar, or does it smell of the truth, raw and terrible and undeniable? It smells of a story well told, Gascoyne said, the words escaping before he could check them, sharper than he intended. He reached for his spectacles, pulling the handkerchief from his pocket, the linen already spotless, and began to fold it with trembling precision. We have an alibi for the woman Squires. Witnesses in Dorset who swear she was there, hundreds of miles away, at the very time Canning claims to have been held in Enfield Wash. Dorset, Fielding straightened up, throwing his hands wide as if dismissing a fly. Gypsies, Crisp, you would weigh the word of a known vagabond, a woman who makes her living by deceit and fortune-telling, against the emaciated testimony of a servant girl who has nothing to gain but her life back. It is absurd. It is a distraction crafted by those who wish to see the law paralyzed by technicality while the innocent suffer. It is not technicality to verify an alibi, Gascoyne insisted, though his voice lacked the boom of authority, sounding thin and reedy in the large room. If we hang the wrong woman, Henry, the rope burns just as deep. The gallows do not distinguish between a gypsy and a Christian once the drop falls. I will not sign a commitment based on sentiment. Sentiment, Fielding's eyes narrowed, the warmth vanishing, replaced by a cold, hard calculation that reminded Gascoyne why the man was feared as much as he was admired. Is it sentiment to believe that Providence placed that girl on the road to Aldermanbury? Is it sentiment to recognize that the reputation of this city, of the very office you hold, depends on our ability to protect the vulnerable from the predations of the desperate? If we let Squires walk, because of some dubious testimony from a county we cannot even verify, we tell every thief and cutpurse in London that the law is blind to their crimes so long as they have a tribe to vouch for them. He tapped the pamphlet again, his finger drumming a rapid, impatient rhythm on the paper. I have laid it out here, Crisp, explaining every contradiction and filling every gap so the narrative stands clear to all who see it. Why do you hesitate? Is it fear, perhaps of the mob, or the dread that you might be wrong? Gascoyne flinched. The question struck home, finding the old wound, the memory of the boy in 49 whose face still visited him in the quiet hours before dawn. He looked down at his hands, at the handkerchief now folded into a tiny, tight square, and felt the familiar urge to retreat, to disappear into the procedural minutiae where nothing was real and no one died. I hesitate, Gascoyne said slowly, forcing the words past the lump in his throat, because once a name is written on a warrant, it is difficult to erase it with ink alone. Blood requires more than a reprieve to wash away. Fielding sighed, a long, exasperated exhalation that fogged in the cold air between them. He stepped back, smoothing the front of his coat, his demeanor shifting from aggressor to disappointed mentor. Then you leave me no choice but to ensure the narrative holds without your seal, for the moment, Fielding said, his tone softening but losing none of its steel. But know this, Crisp, history will not ask us if we were cautious. It will ask if we were just. And when the people tear this building apart because they believe we have failed them, your caution will not stop the stones. He turned on his heel, the heavy cane swinging at his side, and marched towards the broken door. He did not look back. He did not wait for a reply. He simply walked out into the corridor, his voice rising immediately as he addressed the constables and the gathered crowd, booming with a confidence that Gascoyne knew he himself lacked, turning the chaos into a story, making the bloodshed feel like order. Gascoyne sat alone in the room, the single candle flickering in the draught from the ruined door. The pamphlet lay on the desk, a white rectangle in the gloom accusing him. Outside, the cheering began, a rising tide of approval for the man who had given them what they wanted, while inside, the silence returned, heavy and suffocating, broken only by the scratching of Halloway's quill as he waited for the order that Gascoyne knew, with a sinking dread, he would soon have to give. He reached for the commitment warrant. His hand shook. The inkwell waited. And through the open door, the sound of Fielding's voice wove through the mob's roar, binding them together, leaving Gascoyne trapped in the space between the lawyer's ambition and the people's fury, with no path left but forward into the dark. The quill hovered, a single drop of ink gathered at the nib, swollen and black, threatening to fall before the nib touched the paper. Gascoyne held his breath, watching the dark sphere tremble, knowing that once it broke the surface tension, once it struck the fiber of the warrant, There was no taking it back. The ink would soak in. The fibers would swell. The name Squires would be fixed in the record, a permanent stain on the ledger of the city. Outside, the cheering had not diminished. If anything, it had grown louder, a visceral roar that shook the loose pane in the window frame. They were celebrating a victory they had not yet won, baying for blood they had not yet tasted. Fielding's voice cut through the din, even from the yard, distinct and commanding, turning the mob's fury into a chorus of approval. He was out there, basking in it, while Gascoyne sat here in the gloom, tasked with the dirty work of making it legal. He lowered the quill, the nib touched the paper. The scratch was loud, a dry, rasping sound that seemed to echo in the empty room. He wrote the first letter. M. The ink flowed too freely, blotting slightly on the rough stock. He paused, lifting the pen, waiting for the ink to dry. His hand did not stop shaking. It was a fine tremor, invisible to anyone watching from across the room, but to him it felt like a palsy, a sign of the body's rebellion against the mind's command. He thought of the boy again, not the one from the records, not the nameless statistic in the Old Bailey logs, but the face. The way the light had caught the dust on his lashes just before the cap was drawn. The way the rope had tightened, not with a snap, but with a slow, sickening creak of hemp. Gascoyne had told himself then that the law was a machine, and he was merely the operator. But machines did not dream. Machines did not wake in the cold hours before dawn with the taste of ash in their mouths. Squires was a gypsy. The city hated her for it. They hated the way she spoke, the clothes she wore, the fact that she moved without permission across their mapped and guarded lands. To hang her would be easy. The mob would throw flowers. The papers would print hymns. Fielding would write a pamphlet praising the swift hand of justice. To spare her was to invite stones through the windows of his gabled estate. It was to be called a sympathizer, a protector of vagabonds, a man who valued the life of a dealer in old iron over the virtue of an English maid. He dipped the quill again. The inkwell was nearly dry. He scraped the bottom, the sound like a bone on stone. "My lord." Holloway stood in the shadows by the door. He had not moved. He was a statue in livery, waiting for the signal that would set the process in motion. He held the blotting paper in one hand, ready to press, ready to seal the fate. Gascoyne did not look up. He focused on the second letter, A. "Is the carriage ready?" Gascoyne asked. His voice sounded distant, as if spoken by someone else in the room. "Yes, my lord. The horses are chilled. They stamp the cobbles. The driver says the frost is biting deep tonight." "Let them stamp." Gascoyne wrote the R. The line wavered. He corrected it, pressing harder, digging into the paper. "Let them feel the cold. It is nothing to what waits in the cells." Holloway shifted. The leather of his shoes squeaked. "The crowd, my lord, they are asking for her. They say they want to see the chains." "They will see what I show them." As Gascoyne lifted the pen, he looked at the name Mary Squires, which appeared ordinary, just letters and just ink. It did not look like a death sentence, nor did it resemble a life extinguished. That was the trick of it. The law reduced everything to script, turning blood into syntax. He remembered Fielding's words. History will not ask us if we were cautious. Fielding believed in the story. He believed in the narrative arc of the poor maid rescued from the gypsy hag. It was a good story. It had structure. It had a villain. It had a victim. It satisfied the hunger for order in a chaotic world. But Gascoyne knew that stories were not truth. Stories were just things people told themselves to sleep at night. Truth was messy. Truth was a gypsy woman with an alibi in Dorset and a servant girl with hollow cheeks and eyes that did not blink enough. Truth was the possibility that he was about to murder a woman to keep the peace. He moved to the date, February 1753. The numbers flowed easier than the letters. Time moved forward regardless of his hesitation. The winter would end. The Thames would thaw. The body would rot. "My lord," Holloway said again, softer this time, "the ink is wet." Gascoyne reached for the blotter. He did not take it from Holloway. He reached across the desk, his fingers brushing the rough linen of the cloth. He pressed it down. He held it there. He felt the moisture soaking into the fibers, the slow absorption of the liquid into the dry. He counted to 10. He counted to 20. When he lifted the blotter, the name was matte, dark but dry, fixed. He exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that emptied his lungs and left him light-headed. He leaned back in the chair. The wood creaked under his weight. The candle guttered, the flame bending in the draught from the door, casting long, dancing shadows against the paneling. The shadow of the quill looked like a spear. The shadow of his hand looked like a claw. "Take it," Gascoyne said. He pushed the paper across the desk. It slid on the polished wood, stopping at the edge where Holloway stood. "Give it to the keeper. Tell him to wait for my further order." Holloway hesitated, his gaze shifting from the warrant to Gascoyne before he finally spoke. "Wait, my lord, but the commitment says—" "It says what it says." Gascoyne stood up. His knee clicked, a sharp pain shooting up his thigh. He gripped the edge of the desk to steady himself. "But the execution requires my signature. Do not let them raise the scaffold until I say so. Do you understand me? No rope, no cart, not yet." Holloway nodded, then picked up the paper, holding it carefully by the corners as if it were contaminated. "Yes, my lord." "And Holloway." The clerk paused at the door. "My lord. Bar the shutters, all of them. I do not want to see the street. I do not want to hear the singing." Holloway bowed, then stepped out into the corridor where the door clicked shut, the latch engaging with a final, metallic snap. Gascoyne was alone. The candle sputtered. The room smelled of wax and old paper and the metallic tang of the ink. He walked to the window. He did not open it. He stood behind the glass, looking out at the dark shape of the crowd. There were torches in the night, a sea of flickering orange lights moving in unison. They were waiting for the signal. They were waiting for the justice they had been promised. He placed his hand against the glass. It was cold. The chill seeped into his palm, numbing the skin. He thought of Mary Squires in her cell. She would be cold too. She would be listening to the same noise, wondering if the footsteps in the corridor were for her. She would not know that he had signed. She would not know that he had paused. She would only know that the law was a thing that happened to you, like the weather, like the frost, like the plague. He turned away from the window and walked back to the desk, where he picked up the pamphlet titled A Clear State of the Case. Running his thumb over the title, he felt the crisp paper beneath the bold letters. It was a beautiful lie. He threw it into the fire. The edges curled. The black type blurred as the heat took hold. The paper blackened, then flamed, a bright orange burst that illuminated the room for a second before dying down to ash. He watched it burn. He watched until there was nothing left but a pile of grey dust on the grate. It did not make him feel better. It did not cleanse the warrant. The ink was still wet on the desk. The name was still in the ledger. The mob was still outside. He sat down. He put his head in his hands. The silence of the room pressed in on him, heavy and absolute. There was no cheering now, no voice of reason, just the sound of his own breathing, shallow and ragged, and the distant, rhythmic stamping of horses on the frost-bitten cobbles, waiting for the man who had sold them a story to come out and take his bow. But Gascoyne would not go out. He would stay here in the dark. He would let them cheer for the empty chair. He would let them think what they wanted. He had signed the paper. He had bought the time. Now he had to wait for the truth to catch up or for the lie to kill them all. The candle flame dipped low. The wick drowned in the pool of wax. Darkness crept into the corners of the room, swallowing the desk, the chair, the man. And in the dark, the only thing that remained was the scent of burnt paper and the phantom taste of ash on the tongue. The door burst inward, not with a splintering crash, but a groan of overstressed hinges, admitting a gust of air that smelled of wet wool, unwashed bodies, and the sour, yeasty breath of the mob pressing against the threshold. "Back!" shouted the constable, a broad-shouldered man named Miller, whose face was flushed a mottled purple beneath his tricorn. He shoved the woman forward, his boot heels skidding on the polished floorboards as he fought to maintain his balance against the surge of bodies trying to follow her in. "Hold the line, you dogs. She goes to the bench, not to you." Mary Squires stumbled. Her feet, wrapped in rags that had once been leather but were now little more than stiffened mud, caught on the threshold. She did not cry out when she fell, merely grunted, a dry animal sound that was swallowed instantly by the roar erupting from the yard outside. The noise was a physical weight, a wall of sound that vibrated the glass in the window frames and made the candle flames on Gascoyne's desk dance in a frantic, terrified rhythm. They wanted her blood. They wanted the gypsy's throat cut before the sun could set on Aldermanbury. "Get up," Miller hissed, grabbing her by the upper arm. His fingers dug into the thin fabric of her shift, pulling her upright with a roughness that made her shoulder pop. "On your feet, witch, before I let them have you." Gascoyne watched from behind the high desk, his hands resting flat on the wood to hide their trembling. The woman was smaller than he had imagined, a creature eroded by the road until she seemed composed entirely of sharp angles and grime. Her hair, a matted tangle of grey and black, hung in her eyes, obscuring a face that was less a face than a map of hunger and exhaustion. She smelled of the ditch, of wood smoke, of the cold, hard earth where she had slept for nights beyond counting. "Silence," Gascoyne said. His voice was low, a gravelly scrape that lacked the projected power of Fielding's booming oratory, yet it carried a specific, judicial weight that cut through the immediate chaos of the room. "Constable, bring her forward, and bar that door." Miller dragged Squires towards the bench. She did not resist, her body limp, accepting the violence of her arrest with a terrifying passivity that unsettled Gascoyne more than any scream would have. When they reached the desk, Miller shoved her down onto her knees. She stayed there, head bowed, hands clasped in her lap, fingernails black with dirt. "Look at me," Gascoyne commanded. She lifted her head. Her eyes were watery, rimmed with red, but they held a clarity that startled him. There was no guilt in them, no fear even, only a dull, enduring weariness. "What is your name?" Gascoyne asked, though he knew it. The name had been screamed in his ear by a dozen informants, written in a dozen pamphlets, cursed in the coffee houses from Cheapside to Grub Street. "Mary Squires," she whispered. Her voice was rough, stripped bare by smoke and disuse. "I am an honest dealer in old iron, my lord. I have walked the road since I was a girl." "Liar," someone screamed from the corridor, the voice muffled by the heavy oak but sharp with hatred. "Hang her, hang the bitch." Gascoyne flinched, a minute tightening of the jaw that he hoped went unnoticed. He leaned forward, ignoring the protest of his gout-swollen ankle, and extended a hand towards the prisoner. "Give me your hands." Squires hesitated, then slowly unclasped her fingers and held them out. They were cracked, the skin thick and calloused, the knuckles swollen from arthritis and cold. Gascoyne took her left wrist, turning it over to inspect the palm. He was looking for the softness of confinement, the pale, unmarked skin of someone who had spent 7 weeks in a hayloft without labor. Instead, he found the rough, enduring texture of a life spent hauling scrap and walking miles in freezing mud. These were not the hands of a captive, they were the hands of a survivor. "Do you deny knowing Elizabeth Canning?" Gascoyne asked, his thumb brushing over a deep scar that ran across her palm. "I never saw the girl," Squires said, her voice gaining a fraction of strength. "Not before the constables took me. I was in Dorset, my lord, with my son. Ask him. Ask anyone on the road." "Dorset," Gascoyne repeated. The word felt fragile in the air, a thin shield against the battering ram of public certainty. "And yet you are here, in London, accused of theft and imprisonment." "I am here because they needed a body to fill the story," she said, her eyes locking onto his. "They needed a gypsy to blame. It is the way of it." The door shook again, a heavy thud that sent a ripple of dust falling from the lintel. The crowd was growing impatient. The rhythm of their chanting shifted, becoming more aggressive, more unified. Blood for blood, rope for rope. Gascoyne released her wrist. He sat back, the movement stiff and painful, and reached for the quill. The inkwell sat ready, a small pool of black darkness waiting to make the temporary permanent. He looked at Squires, kneeling on the floor, shivering in her rags. He looked at Miller, whose hand rested on the hilt of his staff, ready to drag her away to Newgate, to the damp cells, to the waiting noose. The evidence was a fog. Canning's emaciated frame told one story. The alibi witnesses from Dorset, whom he had not yet heard, told another. The mob told a third, loud and bloody and demanding satisfaction. To commit her was to risk a life on hearsay. To release her was to invite the riot that would tear the Guildhall's oak doors from their hinges. "My lord," Miller prompted, shifting his weight. "The warrant." Gascoyne dipped the quill. The nib scratched against the paper, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to echo in the sudden lull of the room. He did not look at Squires as he wrote. He could not. If he looked at her eyes again, he feared his hand would stop. Mary Squires, he murmured, the letters forming under his hand with a terrible, automatic precision. Committed to Newgate Prison to await trial for felony and robbery. He blew on the ink, the wet sheen dulled, turning matte, fixed. "Take her," Gascoyne said, his voice dropping to a whisper that forced Miller to lean in to catch the words. "And keep her safe. Do you hear me? No harm is to come to her before the trial. If the mob breaks the gate, you answer to me." Miller nodded, though his expression suggested he doubted the efficacy of such an order against the tide of London's fury. He grabbed Squires by the arm again, hauling her to her feet. She did not look back. She simply allowed herself to be turned, to be marched towards the side door that led to the holding cells, her ragged shoes making no sound on the floor. The door closed behind them, the shouting from the yard muffled, becoming a dull, rhythmic thrumming against the walls. Gascoyne was alone. He set the quill down. His fingers felt numb, disconnected from his will. He stared at the warrant, the name Squires staring back at him in bold, black strokes. It was done. The machine had turned. Now the law would take its course, regardless of the truth, regardless of the scar on her palm or the weary defiance in her eyes. He shifted his gaze downward, away from the paper and the room, until his vision settled on a single knot in the oak floorboards, a dark, swirling imperfection in the wood that looked like a tiny vortex trapped in the grain. He focused on it. He breathed in, shallow and quick, before breathing out as the air rattled slightly in his chest. Outside, the crowd roared again, a fresh surge of anger or perhaps triumph, he could not tell. The sound washed over him, distant and meaningless. He kept his eyes on the knot. If he looked up, he would see the shadow of the gallows stretching across the room. If he looked up, he would have to admit that he had just signed a woman's death warrant on the strength of a girl's tears and a city's hunger for a villain. So he watched the wood. He watched the swirl of the grain. He waited for the ink to dry or for the world to end, whichever came first. A knock at the side door broke his trance, not the pounding of the mob, but a sharp, polite rap. Gascoyne blinked, the room snapping back into focus. "Enter." The clerk, Holloway, pushed the door open, holding a stack of papers against his chest. He looked flustered, his wig slightly askew. "My lord," Holloway said, stepping inside and closing the door quickly against the noise. "The ink is not yet dry on the commitment, sir, and already there is a man at the bar claiming to have walked from Dorset with the prisoner. He says he has papers. He says he has witnesses." Gascoyne felt a cold jolt in his stomach, sharp and sudden. He looked at the warrant, then at the door. "Show him in," Gascoyne said, his voice barely audible, "before I change my mind." The door clicked shut, the latch caught with a finality that sounded like a bone snapping. Silence rushed into the room, heavy and suffocating, filling the space where the woman had just been kneeling. It was not a peaceful quiet. It was the held breath of a predator waiting to see if its prey would struggle. Gascoyne sat very still, his hands resting on the edge of the desk, palms flat against the polished mahogany, as if anchoring himself to the wood before the floor gave way. The quill lay beside the warrant, its nib still glistening with a wet, black tear of ink that refused to set. He could not look at the paper, not yet. To look at the name Squires written in his own hand was to acknowledge the transaction. A life traded for a moment's peace, a woman's neck offered up to keep the cobblestones of Aldermanbury free of blood. His gaze dropped, down past the trembling curve of his own wrist, past the heavy fold of black broadcloth sleeve, down to the floor. There in the center of the worn oak plank sat a knot. It was a dark, swirling imperfection, a tiny vortex trapped in the grain where a branch had once fought for light before the tree was felled and sawn and planed into submission. The wood around it was pale, scrubbed clean by decades of boots and brooms, but the knot remained, a stubborn eye staring back at him. He fixed his vision on it. He let the rest of the room blur into a grey wash of shadow and dust motes. Breath in, shallow. The air tasted of stale candle wax and the iron tang of the inkwell. Breath out, a rattle in the chest, dry and thin. Outside, the roar of the crowd surged again. It was a physical thing, a vibration that traveled through the stone foundations and up the legs of his chair, humming in the soles of his shoes. They were chanting now. The words were indistinct, swallowed by the wind and the distance, but the rhythm was clear. "Hang her, hang her, hang her. a drumbeat for a dance he had just authorized. He tightened his grip on the edge of the desk until his knuckles whitened, the skin stretching tight over the bone. The gout in his right toe throbbed, a dull, insistent pulse that matched the beating of his own heart. Pain was good. Pain was honest. It required no interpretation, no weighing of evidence, no moral calculus. It simply was. If he looked up, he would see the shadow of the gallows stretching across the room. He knew it was there, cast by the high-backed chair, elongated by the flickering candlelight into a shape that resembled a noose dangling from the ceiling beams. He had seen it before, in other cases, other winters. The shadow never left, it only waited for the light to change. "Fool," a voice whispered in the back of his mind, sharp and cruel. "You have signed her death warrant on the strength of a girl's tears and a city's hunger for a villain." He squeezed his eyes shut for a second, then forced them open again, locking them back onto the knot in the floor. The swirl of the grain seemed to deepen, pulling him in. If he stared long enough, perhaps the wood would swallow him whole. Perhaps he could dissolve into the floorboards, become part of the foundation, silent and unmoving while the world above tore itself apart. The ink on the warrant was drying. He could smell it, that sharp, acidic scent of chemistry fixing itself onto fiber. Once dry, it became law. Once dry, it became history. And history, in London, was written in blood and remembered only by those who survived the writing. A bead of sweat trickled down his temple, cold and itching, tracing a path through the powder of his wig. He did not wipe it away. To move was to break the spell. To move was to admit that he was sitting in a warm room while a woman was being dragged through the mud to a cell that smelled of urine and despair. Keep her safe, he had told Miller. The words felt hollow now, a pathetic incantation against the tide of human fury. What safety could a constable offer against 1,000 men with stones in their pockets? What protection could a warrant provide against the delight a mob took in breaking things? He thought of Fielding, Henry, with his booming voice and his certainty, his belief that the world could be ordered by the sharpness of a mind and the speed of a constable's horse. Henry would not be staring at a knot in the floor. Henry would be drafting a pamphlet, already shaping the narrative, turning the messy confusion of testimony into a clean, printable truth that the public could digest. Henry would sleep tonight. Gascoyne exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to deflate his entire frame. His shoulders slumped, the heavy black coat suddenly feeling like a lead weight draped over a skeleton. He was tired, not the fatigue of a long day, but a bone-deep weariness that seeped into the marrow, an exhaustion born of knowing that no matter which way he turned, someone would suffer. The crowd outside screamed again, louder this time, a spike of sound that pierced the thick walls. A glass broke somewhere in the yard, the sharp crack distinct even through the roar. They were growing impatient. They wanted to see the chains. They wanted to see the fear. He shifted his weight, and the chair creaked, a lonely sound in the vast, empty room. The knot in the floor remained, indifferent to his torment, a silent witness to the slow erosion of a man's conscience. Just a little longer, he told himself, just until the ink is dry, just until the moment passes. But the moment did not pass. It stretched, elongating like the shadow on the wall, becoming a lifetime compressed into a few seconds of ticking clock hands. The seconds ticked by, each one a hammer blow against his resolve. Then a knock. It was not the frantic pounding of the mob, nor the authoritative rap of a bailiff. It was sharp, polite, and entirely out of place in the cacophony of the afternoon, a civilized sound in a barbaric hour. Gascoyne flinched, his head snapping up before he could stop it. The spell broke. The room rushed back into focus, the shadows sharpening, the smell of ink and sweat becoming overpowering. He blinked, his eyes stinging, the knot in the floor retreating into the periphery of his vision. "Enter," he said, the word scraped out of his throat, rough and unused. The door opened. Holloway slipped inside, closing it quickly against the noise, his face pale and drawn, his wig slightly askew as if he had been running his hands through it in distress. He clutched a stack of papers to his chest like a shield, his knuckles white. "My lord," Holloway said, his voice trembling slightly. He did not approach the desk. He stayed near the door, as if ready to flee back into the chaos of the hallway. The ink is not yet dry on the commitment, sir, and already there is a man at the bar claiming to have walked from Dorset with the prisoner. Gascoyne felt a jolt in his stomach, sharp and sudden, like a hook catching in flesh. He looked at the warrant. The name Squires gleamed wetly in the candlelight, still vulnerable, still capable of being changed. He says he has papers, Holloway continued, the words tumbling out faster now. He says he has witnesses. He claims they can prove she was 50 miles away when the girl says she was chained in the loft. The air in the room seemed to vanish. Gascoyne's lungs seized, refusing to draw breath. He looked at the door, then back at the warrant, then at the clerk's frightened face. The crowd outside roared again, a beast demanding its feed, but the sound seemed to come from a great distance now, muffled by the sudden ringing in his ears. Possibility, dangerous, terrifying possibility. If the man spoke true, then the machine had not just turned, it had jammed. And he, Gascoyne, stood with his hand on the lever, poised to crush a life that might be innocent. He swallowed, the taste of bile rising in his throat. The knot in the floor seemed to spin. "Show him in," Gascoyne said, his voice barely audible, a whisper that barely disturbed the dust motes dancing in the light. "Before I change my mind." "Hold, virtue, hold." The cry came from the usher, a thin man whose voice cracked under the weight of the gallery's anticipation. She stepped forward, not a walk, but a stumble corrected mid-stride, her boots scuffing the oak with a sound like dry leaves dragged over stone. The girl was small, swallowed by a shawl of coarse wool that smelled of wet dog and wood smoke, a scent that cut through the stale air of the courtroom before she even spoke. Her eyes did not meet Gascoyne's. They darted, frantic and bird-like, to the left where the supporters of Fielding sat in rigid rows, their faces set in masks of righteous expectation, then flicked to the right where the shadow of the prisoner's dock loomed empty, waiting. Gascoyne shifted in his chair. The gout in his left foot throbbed, a dull, rhythmic ache that pulsed in time with the ticking of the clock on the mantel. He gripped the silver head of his cane, the metal cold against his palm, grounding him against the urge to shrink back into the high-backed bench. "Approach the bar," Gascoyne said. His voice was low, a gravelly rumble that forced the room to lean in, to strain against the silence he cultivated like a garden weed. Hall stopped. Her hands emerged from the shawl, clutching the fabric at her throat, knuckles white as bone china. She trembled, not the fine vibration of cold, but the gross, shaking palsy of a creature caught in a trap it had helped build. "You have sworn to this court," Gascoyne began, watching the pulse jump in her neck, a frantic blue river under pale skin, "that you were present in the house at Enfield Wash during the confinement of Elizabeth Canning. You stated you saw the prisoner, Mary Squires, cut the stays from the girl's body." "Yes, my lord." The words popped out, too quick, too rehearsed, a script memorized in a cell or a coffee house. "And you described the room." Gascoyne paused. He let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating, until the scratching of a quill in the clerk's corner sounded like a knife being sharpened. "You told the magistrates at Bow Street that the fire was in the chimney, that the bed stood against the far wall, that the door opened inward." Hall nodded, a jerky, mechanical bobbing of the chin. "Yes, just so." "Describe the window." The question hung in the air, simple and unadorned. Hall blinked, her mouth opened, then closed. She looked at the gallery again. A man in the front row, a broad-shouldered fellow with the ink-stained fingers of a printer, leaned forward, his eyebrows raised in a silent command. "Say it," the gesture screamed. "Stick to the tale." "The window, my lord," her voice pitched higher, thinning out. "The window through which the girl claimed to have escaped," Gascoyne pressed, leaning forward until the heavy broadcloth of his coat creaked. "You swore you watched her drop. You swore you saw the moonlight on the glass. Tell me, was the casement on the left of the fireplace or the right?" Hall's fingers twisted the wool of her shawl, pulling at a loose thread until the fabric began to fray. She stared at the floorboards, at a knot in the wood that mirrored the one Gascoyne had been studying moments before. It was dark, my lord." "It was January," Gascoyne said, his tone flat, devoid of accusation yet heavy with the weight of the calendar. The moon was full. You had a candle, did you not? You stated you were working by candlelight when the girl entered. The silence returned, but this time it was different. It was not the respectful hush of a court awaiting wisdom. It was the held breath of a crowd sensing a crack in the ice. Fielding's men shifted in their seats, the leather of their boots squeaking in protest. One of them coughed, a sharp, warning bark. Hall flinched, her shoulders hunched, drawing her head down into the shawl as if she could disappear into the rough weave. "I cannot recall," she whispered. Gascoyne felt a jolt, sharp and electric, run up his spine. He did not move. He kept his hands folded on the desk, hiding the tremor that had started in his left thumb. He looked at her hands. They were raw, the skin chapped and red, the nails bitten down to the quick. They were the hands of a servant, yes, but they were also the hands of a liar caught in the act. They clutched the shawl with a desperation he knew intimately. He knew that grip. It was the same way he held his cane when the mob outside screamed for blood. The same way he clutched his own certainty when the evidence began to slip like water through a sieve. She was afraid, though not of him nor of the law. She was afraid of the people behind her, the very same whose stones were currently rattling the windows of the gilded town hall as they demanded the gypsy's throat be cut. "The court grows dim," the clerk murmured from the shadows, his voice a dry rustle. "The candles burn low, my lord, perhaps an adjournment." Gascoyne turned his head slowly. The wicks sputtered, casting long, dancing shadows that made the faces in the gallery look like grotesques, their features stretched and distorted. The light was failing, the day was dying, and with it, perhaps, the truth. "No," Gascoyne said, the word landing like a hammer blow. "We do not stop." He turned back to Hall. She was swaying slightly, fatigue warring with terror. Her eyes were wide, glassy, reflecting the flickering flame of the nearest candle. "Look at me, Miss Hall." She raised her head. Her face was pale, slick with a sheen of sweat that made her look feverish. "You are tired," Gascoyne said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register that forced her to lean in, to bridge the gap between the bench and the bar. "The road from Bow Street is long, the air in here is thick, but you are under oath, and God sees you even if the candle does not." He saw the conflict tear at her. The desire to flee, to run out into the night and never look back, battled against the crushing weight of the narrative she had helped construct. She glanced at the printer again. The man's face had hardened. He mouthed something, steady. But the fatigue was a solvent. It ate away at the edges of the lie. "The room," Hall breathed. Her voice was so faint Gascoyne had to stop breathing entirely to hear it. "It wasn't. The fire wasn't in the chimney." Gascoyne froze. The quill in the clerk's hand stopped scratching. The only sound was the distant, muffled roar of the city, a beast pacing outside the walls. "Speak clearly," Gascoyne commanded, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Hall leaned forward, her body shielding her mouth from the gallery, from Fielding's men, from the world. She smelled of fear, sour and sharp. "There was no fire," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of terrified air. "The house was empty, my lord, cold as the grave. The girl never stayed there, not that night." The confession hung between them, a fragile, deadly thing. Gascoyne felt the floor tilt beneath him. The knot in the wood seemed to spin again, faster now. The machine had not just jammed, it had shattered, and he was holding the pieces. He looked at Hall, really looked at her, and saw not a witness, but a mirror. A reflection of his own cowardice, staring back with wide, terrified eyes. "Write that down," Gascoyne said to the clerk, his voice sounding as if it came from a great distance, word for word. But the clerk did not move. He was staring at Hall, his mouth slightly open, the quill hovering over the paper like a bird, unsure whether to land or fly. Outside, the crowd surged. A new chant began, rhythmic and bloodthirsty, shaking the very foundations of the room. They wanted Squires. They wanted the end. They did not want the truth. Gascoyne gripped the cane until his knuckles turned white. The ink on the warrant was still wet. The shadow of the gallows stretched across the floor, reaching for them both. "Miss Hall," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the rising storm, You have just signed your own death warrant, or hers. Hall closed her eyes. A single tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. I know, she said, God help us all. The candle flickered and died, plunging that corner of the room into darkness. Virtue Hall's fingers worked the edge of her shawl, twisting the coarse wool until the fibers frayed white against her knuckles. She kept her gaze averted from the gallery, refusing to acknowledge Fielding's men, who sat rigid in the back rows, like carved effigies waiting for the cue to rise. Her eyes remained fixed on the floorboards between her own feet, where a stain of old ink spread like a bruise across the wood. Gascoyne watched the hands. They trembled, not the palsy of age, but the fine, rapid shiver of a creature caught in a trap it had walked into willingly. He knew the sensation. It lived in his own left thumb whenever the crowd outside the mansion house began to chant, a vibration that traveled up the silver head of his cane and settled in the bone. He shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight, and adjusted the wig that scratched at his neck like a wire cage. Miss Hall. She flinched. The sound of his voice seemed to strike her physically, a blow delivered without force. My lord, her throat clicked. The word barely cleared her lips. You stated earlier that you saw the prisoner, Mary Squires, within the room at Enfield Wash. Gascoyne kept his tone flat, devoid of the rhetorical flourish Fielding favored. He did not need to decorate the truth. He needed to excavate it. You described the fire. You described the light. Hall nodded, a jerky, mechanical motion. Yes, my lord. The candle. Gascoyne leaned forward, the movement causing a sharp protest from his gouty knee. He ignored it. You said you were working by candlelight when the girl entered, yet you hesitate now. She stopped, her breath hitching as a ragged sound in the quiet room. I am tired, my lord. We are all tired. The clerk shifted in the shadows to Gascoyne's right. The scratching of his quill had ceased minutes ago, the inkwell dry, the page waiting. He leaned in, his face pale in the dying light. The court grows dim, the clerk murmured. His voice was a dry rustle, like leaves dragged over stone. The candles burn low, my lord, perhaps an adjournment. The hour is late. Gascoyne turned his head. The wicks sputtered, black smoke curling up to stain the ceiling plaster. The light was failing. The day was dying, and with it perhaps the truth. If he stopped now, the momentum would break. Hall would retreat into the safety of the night, surrounded by Fielding's supporters who would whisper guidance into her ear until morning. She would return tomorrow with her story polished, the cracks filled with lies. He looked back at Hall. She was swaying slightly, fatigue warring with terror. Her eyes were wide, glassy, reflecting the flickering flame of the nearest candle. She smelled of fear, sour and sharp, mixed with the damp wool of her cloak. No, Gascoyne said. The word landed heavy, a hammer blow on the wood of the bench. We do not stop. The clerk recoiled slightly, pulling his hand back from the ledger. He did not argue. He knew the tone. It was the voice of a man who had decided to walk into the fire rather than wait for it to consume him. Miss Hall, Gascoyne said, his voice dropping to that low, intimate register that forced her to lean in, to bridge the gap between the bench and the bar. The road from Bow Street is long, the air in here is thick, but you are under oath, and God sees you even if the candle does not. He saw the conflict tear at her. The desire to flee, to run out into the night and never look back, battled against the crushing weight of the narrative she had helped construct. She glanced at the printer in the gallery. The man's face had hardened. He mouthed something, steady. But the fatigue was a solvent. It ate away at the edges of the lie. It stripped away the rehearsed lines until only the raw, terrified core remained. Gascoyne waited. He did not press. He let the silence stretch, thin and taut, until it threatened to snap. Outside, the mob surged. A new chant began, rhythmic and bloodthirsty, shaking the very foundations of the room. They wanted Squires. They wanted the end. They did not want the truth. Gascoyne gripped the cane until his knuckles turned white. The ink on the warrant was still wet. The long, skeletal shade of the executioner's beam stretched across the floor, reaching for them both. He thought of the previous era, the hasty conviction that had led to a man hanging for a crime he likely did not commit. The memory sat in his gut like a stone. He would not add another weight to it, not tonight. The room, Hall breathed, Her voice was so faint Gascoyne had to stop breathing entirely to hear it. The fire wasn't in the chimney. Gascoyne froze. The quill in the clerk's hand hovered over the paper, a bird unsure whether to land or fly. The only sound was the distant, muffled roar of the city, a beast pacing outside the walls. "Speak clearly," Gascoyne commanded, though his heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. Hall leaned forward, her body shielding her mouth from the gallery, from Fielding's men, from the world. She smelled of fear, sour and sharp. "There was no fire," she whispered, the words tumbling out in a rush of terrified air. "The house was empty, my lord, cold as the grave. The girl never stayed there, not that night." The confession hung between them, a fragile, deadly thing, and Gascoyne felt the floor tilt beneath him. As the knot in the wood seemed to spin again, faster now, he realized the machine had not just jammed, it had shattered, and he was holding the pieces. He looked at Hall, really looked at her, and saw not a witness, but a mirror. A reflection of his own cowardice, staring back with wide, terrified eyes. "Write that down," Gascoyne said to the clerk, his voice sounding as if it came from a great distance, word for word. But the clerk did not move. He was staring at Hall, his mouth slightly open. Outside, the crowd surged. A new chant began, rhythmic and bloodthirsty, shaking the very foundations of the room. They wanted squires. They wanted the end. They did not want the truth. Gascoyne gripped the cane until his knuckles turned white. The ink on the warrant was still wet. The shadow of the gallows stretched across the floor, reaching for them both. "Miss Hall," he said, his voice barely a whisper against the rising storm, "you have just signed your own death warrant, or hers." Hall closed her eyes. A single tear tracked through the grime on her cheek. "I know," she said, "God help us all." The candle flickered and died, plunging that corner of the room into darkness. Truth has an accent, rough, earthy, rooted in the soil of a county far from the fevered streets of London. "This here paper," the farmer said, holding out a sheet that smelled of turnips and wood smoke. "Signed by the vicar, signed by the overseer. She was in Dorset, my lord, cutting turf while this London girl claims she was starving in a loft." Gascoyne leaned forward. The movement sent a spike of fire through his gouty ankle, sharp enough to make his breath hitch, but he did not flinch. He could not. The gallery pressed against the rails, a wall of bodies radiating heat and the sour tang of unwashed wool. They wanted blood. They wanted the gypsy woman hanged before the sun set. Yet here stood a man from Bridport, calloused hands gripping the rail, swearing on his salvation that Mary Squires had been walking the roads of the West Country when Elizabeth Canning claimed she was being held in Enfield Wash. Impossible, both could not be true. "Did you see her yourself?" Gascoyne asked. His voice came out low, gravelly, forcing the front rows to lean in rather than shout. "I, every day from January 1st to the 20th. The farmer turned to the jury, eyes wide with a rustic indignation. "We don't lie about faces in Dorset, sir, not when a woman's neck is on the line." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. It started low, a vibration in the floorboards, then grew into a shuffling noise that sounded like rats moving through straw. Gascoyne shifted his weight onto the silver-headed cane, the cold metal biting into his palm. He looked down the bench. Henry Fielding sat rigid, his back straight as a poker, eyes fixed on a point somewhere above the judge's wig. He kept his gaze locked on the ceiling beams, ignoring both the farmer and the paper, as if the answer to this contradiction were written in the dust up there. Fielding had built this case. He had woven the narrative of the poor injured maid with the skill of a novelist crafting a villain, and now the threads were snagging on the rough facts of a Dorset winter. To admit the alibi was to admit error. To admit error was to fracture the authority of the Bow Street magistrates. Gascoyne knew that look on Fielding's face. It was the stubbornness of a man who would let the world burn rather than concede he had misread the smoke. The air in the room thickened. It wasn't just the heat of so many bodies, it was the weight of the lie collapsing. The damp wool scent of the gallery turned sour, curdling into something like fear. Gascoyne could feel it pressing against his temples, a physical pressure that made his vision blur at the edges. He needed to see clearly. He needed to read the dates on that paper without the candlelight swimming before his eyes. He reached into his pocket. His fingers found the linen handkerchief, already spotless, already folded with geometric precision. He pulled it out. He took off his spectacles. The movement was small, but in the hush of the court it sounded like a gunshot. The metal hinges clicked. He began to wipe the lenses. Circular motions, slow, deliberate. His hands trembled just slightly, a vibration that traveled up his wrists and settled in his elbows. He folded the linen, unfolded it, wiped again. There was no smudge. There was never a smudge. It was the only thing he could control, the only thing he could clean. "My lord," the clerk whispered, leaning close enough that Gascoyne could smell the ink on his cuffs. "The prosecution wishes to cross-examine." Gascoyne paused, the spectacles hovering in his hand like two glass eyes staring back at him. He looked at Fielding, who remained rigid and fixed on the beams, still refusing to acknowledge that the timeline was shattered. "No," Gascoyne said. The word landed heavy, a hammer blow on the wood of the bench. "Not today." He put the spectacles back on. The world snapped into focus, sharp and unforgiving. The farmer was still holding the paper. The jury was whispering amongst themselves, heads bowed together like conspirators. They looked terrified. They knew what waited outside those doors. The mob did not care about Vickers in Dorset. They cared about the story they had been fed. They cared about the maid. "We have heard enough for one session," Gascoyne announced, pushing himself up while his gout screamed in protest, yet he stood tall because he had to. If he slumped, they would smell the weakness. "The court will rise. We reconvene at 9 tomorrow." A groan went up from the gallery. It was a single sound, made of hundreds of throats, disappointed and angry. Chairs scraped against the floor. The noise was chaotic, a sudden release of tension that had nowhere to go. Gascoyne gripped the cane. He needed to move. He needed to get out of this room before the walls closed in. He turned to step down from the bench, but a movement in the jury box caught his eye. The foreman, a haberdasher from Cheapside, a man Gascoyne had known by sight for 10 years. The man was not gathering his papers. He was not speaking to his fellows. He was staring directly at Gascoyne. Their eyes locked across the distance. The foreman's face was pale, the skin pulled tight over his cheekbones. There was no judgment in his look, no anger, only a raw, naked terror. He shook his head, barely perceptible, a tiny movement that said everything. "We cannot do this. We cannot satisfy them." Gascoyne froze. The cane slipped slightly on the wooden step, catching with a clatter that echoed in the sudden lull of the room. The foreman looked away, down at his hands, as if he had just confessed to a crime himself. The hook was set. The city wanted blood, and the law had no throat to cut. The clatter of the cane against the step hung in the air, a sharp, brittle note that severed the rising din of the gallery. Gascoyne did not retrieve it immediately. To bend now would be to surrender the last shred of vertical authority he possessed. He stood frozen, one hand gripping the edge of the bench, until the knuckles blanched white against the black broadcloth of his sleeve, the other hovering uselessly over the empty space where the silver head should have rested. The gout in his ankle throbbed, a dull, rhythmic pounding that seemed to sync with the frantic beating of his own heart. Or perhaps it was just the blood rushing in his ears, drowning out the shuffling of the crowd. Outside, the wind had picked up, rattling the leaded panes of the Old Bailey with a skeletal rattle that sounded too much like bones knocking together in a box. Inside, the heat was suffocating, a stew of unwashed bodies and wet wool that had long since lost any pretense of freshness. It smelled of fear, not the clean, sharp scent of danger, but the sour, curdled odor of people realizing they are trapped between a rock and a hard place with no room to maneuver. The Dorset farmer had sat down, his testimony hanging in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, undeniable and yet somehow insufficient against the roaring narrative Fielding had constructed. Gascoyne finally stooped, wincing as the movement sent a lance of fire up his leg, and grasped the cane. He pulled himself upright, the wood groaning under his weight. He could not look at the gallery. If he looked, he would see the faces of the Canningites, the men and women who had turned the maid's suffering into a religion, and he knew what he would find there, not a desire for truth, not a hunger for justice. Only a ravenous need for confirmation, for the story to hold together so that their own righteous anger remained justified. They wanted a witch. They wanted a gypsy villain to burn so that their poor injured maid could remain a saint. The alibi from the West Country threatened to unravel the whole tapestry, and they would not forgive the man who held the shears. He turned his gaze instead to the jury box. 12 men, good men mostly, shopkeepers, tradesmen, fathers of families, men who understood the value of an honest day's work and the sanctity of an oath, or so he had thought when he empaneled them. Now they looked like deer caught in a thicket, ears swiveling, muscles coiled, waiting for the hounds to tear them apart. The foreman, Mr. Henderson, a haberdasher with a respectable shop near St. Paul's, had dropped his gaze to his hands. Those hands were resting on the wooden rail, fingers intertwined so tightly that the tips were bloodless. He was not looking at the farmer. He was not looking at the empty space where Mary Squires should have been seated, though she was confined in Newgate and could not attend. He was looking at his own thumbs, as if searching for a clue in the whorls of his skin that might tell him how to survive the night. Gascoyne took a step, then another. The floorboards creaked, a protest against the weight of the law moving through the room. He needed to leave. The impulse was physical, a primal urge to flee that rose from the same gut that told him to recoil from a snake. Every instinct screamed at him to retreat to the stone-walled sanctuary of the Guildhall, to lock the doors, to pour a glass of brandy and sit by the fire until the world outside stopped spinning. But he was the Lord Mayor. He was the judge. He was the anchor, and if he drifted, the whole ship would founder on the rocks of public opinion. "My lord," the clerk whispered again, this time with an edge of panic that cut through the fog of Gascoyne's exhaustion. "The crowd, they are pressing against the barriers." Gascoyne halted. He did not need to turn to know it was true. He could feel the pressure, a physical force emanating from the back of the room, pushing forward like a tide. The air grew heavier, charged with the static of impending violence. He could hear the muttering now, a low rumble that started in the throats of the men at the rear and rolled forward, gathering volume and venom as it went. Words were indistinct, swallowed by the general din, but the tone was clear. It was the tone of a mob denied its prey. It was the sound of disappointment curdling into rage. "He knows," someone hissed, though whether they referred to Gascoyne, Fielding, or the farmer was impossible to say. "He knows she's lying." "Liar," another voice shouted, sharper, cutting through the murmur. "Send her to the gallows." The shout ignited the room. The shuffling ceased, replaced by a surge of movement as people strained against the constables holding the rails. Hats were knocked askew, elbows jabbed into ribs. A woman near the front began to weep, a high, keening sound that grated on Gascoyne's nerves like a sore on bone. She was crying for Canning, or perhaps for herself, for the terrifying realization that the world was not as orderly as she had believed. Gascoyne tightened his grip on the cane. His knuckles ached. He forced himself to breathe, drawing the foul air deep into his lungs, holding it until his chest burned, then exhaling slowly through his nose. Panic was a luxury he could not afford. Panic was for the accused, for the witnesses, for the poor souls in the gallery who had no power. He had power, he had the law, or at least he had the semblance of it. He looked back at Henderson. The foreman had lifted his head again. Their eyes met for a second time, and this time there was no ambiguity in the message. Henderson's pupils were dilated, swallowing the iris, leaving only a ring of terrified brown. His mouth worked silently, forming words that made no sound. "Help us, or perhaps save us." It did not matter. The meaning was the same. They were caught. If they acquitted Squires, the mob outside would tear the court apart, and possibly them with it. If they convicted her, they would be sending an innocent woman to the noose, assuming the Dorset alibi was truer, and God help them if it was, for that blood would be on their hands forever. Gascoyne felt a cold sweat break out on his forehead, trickling down the side of his face beneath the heavy wig. The horsehair itched, a maddening irritation that he could not scratch without drawing attention. He wanted to rip the thing off, to cast it onto the floor and stomp on it, to stand bareheaded before the city and admit that he did not know, that he could not know, that the truth was a slippery eel that had vanished into the mud. But he could not. The wig was part of the armor. Without it, he was just a man with a bad leg and a trembling hand. With it, he was the embodiment of the Crown's justice. "Order," Gascoyne said. His voice was low, but it carried a resonance that silenced the immediate vicinity. "Keep order." It was a futile command. The noise at the back of the room continued to swell, a wave crashing against the shore. The constables were struggling, their faces red with exertion, pushing back against the press of bodies. One of them stumbled, going down to one knee, and for a moment the barrier seemed ready to collapse. Fielding finally moved, turning his head slowly and deliberately to look at Gascoyne. There was no triumph in his eyes, no gloating, only a cold, hard calculation. He knew the game was changing and that the alibi had struck a blow that might be fatal to his case, yet he also knew the mob. If Gascoyne faltered now or showed any sign of doubt, the city would descend into chaos. Fielding's jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. He gave a barely perceptible nod. It was not a gesture of friendship, but a demand: hold the line. Gascoyne returned the nod, though his stomach churned with bile. Turning back to the court, he forced his shoulders to square and his spine to straighten despite the agony in his ankle, driven by the need to get them out of here. He had to separate the jury from the mob, giving them space to breathe, to think, to perhaps find a path through this minefield that did not end in bloodshed. But as he opened his mouth to speak the formal dismissal, he saw Henderson's hand move. The foreman reached into his pocket and pulled out a handkerchief. It was white, clean, just like Gascoyne's. He began to fold it over and over, a tiny, frantic motion that mirrored the turmoil in Gascoyne's own soul. The disaster was not in the verdict. The disaster was already here, in this room, in the eyes of 12 men who knew they were damned whatever they chose. Gascoyne realized, with a jolt that nearly stopped his heart, that he had no escape either. The hemp noose destined for Mary Squires had already tightened its invisible knot around every throat in the court, encompassing them all. "Court rises," Gascoyne said, the words tasting of ash. "God have mercy on us all." He turned away before he could see the reaction, before he could witness the final fracturing of the room. He took a step towards the door, his cane striking the floor with a decisive crack that echoed like a pistol shot. Behind him, the roar of the crowd surged forward, a tidal wave of sound that threatened to engulf him, but he kept his gaze fixed on the exit, refusing to let the noise pull his head around. He could not. The image of Henderson's terrified eyes was burned into his mind, a brand that would not fade, a reminder that the law was not a shield, but a sword that cut both ways. And tonight, it hung by a thread, poised to strike whoever stood beneath it. The verdict landed like a hammer blow on an anvil, vibrating through the floorboards and up the legs of the bench. "Guilty." One word, spoken by Henderson, whose voice cracked on the second syllable, thin and reedy, against the sudden, explosive roar that erupted from the gallery. The sound was not human. It was the bellow of a beast waking from a long, hungry sleep, a physical force that shook the dust from the rafters of the Old Bailey and sent a shower of grey grit drifting down onto the wig of the Lord Mayor. Gascoyne flinched, his shoulders hunching instinctively as if to ward off a physical strike, but he remained seated, anchored to the scarred wood of the bench by the twin weights of his office and the searing fire in his gout-swollen ankle. Around him, the clerks and the lesser magistrates scrambled to their feet, chairs scraping harshly against the stone, a chaotic rustle of broadcloth and panic that stood in stark contrast to his own frozen stillness. He gripped the arms of his chair until his knuckles turned the color of old parchment, the silver head of his cane digging into his palm, a sharp, grounding pain that barely registered against the numbness spreading through his chest. They wanted blood. The cry went up instantly, a rhythmic chanting that pounded against the high windows, demanding the rope, demanding the cart, demanding the finality of death for the woman who stood trembling in the dock below. Mary Squires kept her gaze riveted to the floorboards. She stared at her own feet, wrapped in rags that smelled of wet wool and wood smoke, her body swaying slightly as though the wind from the crowd's breath might topple her. Gascoyne watched her, really watched her, for the first time since the trial began in earnest, and saw not a criminal, but a creature worn down to the bone, a thing of sharp angles and terrified silence that bore no resemblance to the monster the pamphlets had painted. He knew with a certainty that sat heavy and cold in his gut that the alibi from Dorset was true. He had seen the witnesses, heard their consistent, unadorned testimony, and felt the jagged edges of the contradiction that Fielding had so skillfully papered over with rhetoric and fame. Yet here they were. The law, that great, blind engine of the state, had churned forward, grinding the truth into dust beneath the wheels of public fury. "Order," Gascoyne shouted, though the word was swallowed whole by the din. He tried to rise, to assert the dignity of the mayoralty, but a lance of white-hot agony shot from his ankle to his knee, forcing him back down with a suppressed grunt. The pain was a mercy, in a way. It gave him an excuse for his inertia, a physical reason for failing to stand when his moral spine had already buckled. Fielding was there, somewhere in the throng of standing men, likely nodding with that grim satisfaction of a man who believes he has steered the ship safely through the storm, unaware that he has merely navigated them onto the rocks. Gascoyne could not bring himself to look at him. To meet Fielding's eye now would be to acknowledge the complicity, to admit that they had both played their parts in a theatre of lies where the only real thing was the rope waiting at Tyburn. The clerk leaned in, his face pale and slick with sweat, holding out the warrant with a hand that shook so violently the paper rattled. "My lord," the clerk whispered, his voice barely audible over the chanting outside. "The commitment, it must be signed before they break the doors." Gascoyne looked at the document. The ink was still wet on the lines defining the crime, the black letters stark and accusing against the cream vellum. Mary Squires, felony, death. The words seemed to swim before his eyes, blurring into a single dark smear. He reached for the quill, his fingers feeling thick and clumsy, as if they belonged to someone else, someone who had not spent the last 3 weeks listening to the conflicting tales of a maid and a gypsy until the distinction between truth and falsehood had dissolved entirely. The quill felt heavy, a leaden rod rather than a tool of writing, and when he dipped it into the inkwell, the nib scraped against the bottom with a sound that made his teeth ache. He hesitated. For a heartbeat, 2 heartbeats, the world narrowed down to the tip of that quill hovering above the line where his signature would seal a woman's fate. He could refuse. He could throw the pen down, kick over the inkwell, declare a mistrial, do anything but this. He could become the target the mob desired, let them tear at his clothes and scream in his face, let them call him corrupt and weak and blind. It would be easier, perhaps, to die by their hands than to live with this. But the image of the previous era, the man he had sent to the gallows years ago, whose face still visited him in the small hours of the morning, rose up to block the path of courage. That man had been innocent too, or so Gascoyne had come to believe, and the memory of that finality, that irreversible silence, paralyzed him now more effectively than any threat of violence. The roar outside intensified, a sudden surge of impact against the double doors that sent a tremor through the floor. They were coming in. If he did not sign, the blood spilled in the next 10 minutes would be on his head, not just Squire's. The corporation would fall, the city would burn, and for what? A chance, a mere possibility that he was right and Fielding was wrong. The weight of the institution, the crushing burden of keeping the peace in a city that teetered always on the brink of chaos, pressed down upon his shoulders until he felt he might collapse under it. He signed. The scratch of the nib against the paper was loud, a tearing sound that seemed to rip through the quiet of the clerk's corner even as the crowd screamed beyond. Crisp Gascoyne. The letters were jagged, uneven, lacking the usual flourishes of his official hand, looking more like the scrawl of a dying man than the signature of the Lord Mayor. He set the quill down immediately, pushing it away as if it were a venomous snake, and wiped his hand on his breeches, trying to rub away the sensation of the ink, the feel of the act itself. It did not come off. The stain seemed to have seeped into the skin, into the bone, marking him as surely as the brand of a felon. "Take her," Gascoyne said, his voice a low gravel that no one heard. The clerk snapped the warrant shut, the sound like a bone breaking, and hurried away towards the dock, where the constables were already closing in on Squires. Gascoyne watched them go, watching the dark coat of the prisoner disappear into the press of uniforms, watching the last glimpse of her ragged shawl vanish through the side door that led to the cells. He did not stand. He did not offer a prayer. He sat alone on the bench, while the room emptied around him, the noise of the crowd fading slightly as the focus of their hunger moved from the courtroom to the street, following the prisoner to her cage. Silence returned, but it was not the peaceful quiet of a job well done. It was the hollow, ringing silence of a tomb. Gascoyne finally pushed himself up, using the cane to lever his weight off the chair, his legs screaming in protest with every inch of movement. He limped towards the exit, the heavy black broadcloth of his robes dragging against the floor, feeling suddenly ancient, eroded by the damp and the weariness of a winter that showed no sign of ending. He needed air. He needed to breathe something other than the stale scent of fear and ink that permeated the court. He pushed open the heavy oak doors and stepped out into the frozen night. The air hit him like a physical blow, sharp with coal smoke and the metallic tang of snow that had yet to fall. The street was a churning mass of shadows and torchlight, the mob still surging against the barriers, their faces upturned and grotesque in the flickering glow. They were shouting still, but the words were indistinct now, merged into a single, continuous drone of vengeance. Gascoyne pulled his cloak tighter around his throat, turning his collar up against the chill, and began the slow, painful walk towards his carriage. Each step was a negotiation with pain, a reminder of his own frailty in the face of the city's immense, unfeeling machinery. He had done his duty. He had upheld the law. He had satisfied the form. And in doing so, he felt he had murdered something essential within himself, a piece of his soul that would not grow back. "My lord." The voice came from behind him, small and tentative. Gascoyne stopped but did not turn. He knew the voice. It was the clerk, standing in the doorway of the Old Bailey, holding the quill still in his hand, the nib dark with dried ink. "The pardon," the clerk said, his voice trembling slightly in the cold air as he asked if he should prepare the quill for such a document, noting that there was still time before the Privy Council meets should you have doubts. Gascoyne stared at the carriage door, his hand resting on the cold iron handle. The question hung in the frost between them, suspended and terrible, to go back, to undo it, to face the fire again. He closed his eyes for a second, seeing Henderson's dilated pupils, feeling the scratch of the quill, hearing the roar of the beast. He opened the carriage door. He did not answer. He climbed inside, leaving the question hanging in the frozen air, leaving the clerk standing alone in the light of the torches, holding a pen that had no more ink to give. The question did not land. It hung there, a wisp of steam in the freezing dark, dissolving before it could touch the black lacquer of the carriage door. Gascoyne's hand tightened on the iron handle. The metal bit into his palm, cold enough to burn, a sharp, biting pain that felt more honest than the dull, throbbing ache in his gouty ankle. He could feel the wood of the step beneath his boot, rough and splintered from 1,000 hurried ascents. Behind him, the clerk waited. The man's breathing was audible, a shallow, rapid flutter that matched the frantic tapping of the quill against his own thumb. A plea, an escape route. A chance to scrape the ink back into the bottle and pretend the signature had never dried. To turn around would be to admit that the law was a fiction, that the verdict was a mistake, that the roar of the mob outside the barriers was not the voice of God, but the baying of a beast that had been fed a lie. Fielding would hear of it within the hour. The coffee houses would have it by morning. Gascoyne wavers, Gascoyne doubts. Gascoyne fears the rope more than he loves the truth. The corporation would crumble. The city, already teetering on the edge of riot, would tip into the abyss. And for what? A gypsy woman whose alibi was strong, but whose face was hated by every honest tradesman in London. He looked at his hand. The ink stain remained, a dark smear across the knuckle that no amount of rubbing had shifted. It looked like a bruise, like a mark of Cain. "My lord," the clerk stepped forward, the hem of his coat crunching on the frost-rimed gravel. "The council does not sit until Tuesday. We could draft the reprieve tonight." Quietly, no one need know the hesitation came from the bench. Gascoyne closed his eyes. The image of Mary Squires rose up, not as the monster the papers painted, but as she had been in the dock, small, defiant, her eyes hard as flint, refusing to beg for a life she claimed she had not stolen. She had spoken of Dorset, of roads walked, of fires lit, of faces seen, witnesses who swore to her presence miles away, while Canning starved in a loft that smelled of hay and lies. The evidence was a tangle of contradictions, a knot that tightened every time he pulled at it. But the jury had spoken, the law had spoken, and he, the Lord Mayor, the judge, the keeper of the peace, had signed the warrant that would stretch her neck until the bones snapped. If he stopped now, if he called the clerk back and dipped the quill again, he would be signing his own death warrant in the court of public opinion. The mob outside was not waiting for justice. They wanted blood. They wanted the story to end with the hanging, with the finality of a body swinging in the wind, so they could go home to their warm beds and sleep without wondering if the maid's tale was true. To deny them that closure was to invite the stones through the windows of the mansion house. to invite the torch to the door. He had seen it before, the way a city could turn on its own magistrates when the narrative fractured. He remembered the face of the man he had sent to the gallows years ago, the one whose innocence had whispered to him in the dark hours of the night ever since. That man had been innocent, or so Gascoyne had come to believe, and the memory of that finality, that irreversible silence, had paralyzed him then just as it paralyzed him now. But then he had been younger, more certain. Now the uncertainty was a cancer, eating him from the inside out, leaving him hollow and brittle. "Go back inside, Mr. Clark," Gascoyne said. His voice was low, stripped of inflection, a flat stone dropped into a deep well. He did not turn to look at the man. He kept his eyes on the carriage interior, on the worn velvet of the seat, the smell of old leather and damp wool that clung to it. "The warrant is signed. The law has taken its course." "But my lorder," the clerk's voice cracked, a thin, reedy sound that was swallowed instantly by the distant drone of the crowd. "If she is innocent, if the Dorset witnesses are truthful." If, Gascoyne tested the word, and it tasted like ash. The law does not deal in ifs, it deals in what is proven, and they have proven her guilty. "They have proven nothing," the clerk's whisper cut through the cold air, sharp now and desperate. "They have proven only that the city wants a witch to burn. You know it, and I know it. Even Fielding, in his heart, must suspect." "Fielding suspects nothing," Gascoyne snapped, the sudden anger flaring hot and brief in his chest before dying away into exhaustion. "Fielding sees what he wishes to see, a story of virtue rescued, a triumph of the new constabulary. He needs this conviction as much as the mob needs the spectacle. Do not mistake his certainty for truth, sir. It is merely ambition wearing the mask of justice." He stepped up into the carriage. The motion sent a jolt of fire through his ankle, and he gripped the door frame to steady himself, his knuckles white against the black paint. Inside, the darkness was absolute, a suffocating embrace that smelled of stale air and his own fear. He sat down heavily, the springs groaning under his weight, and pulled the door shut with a solid, final click. Through the small, grimy window, he saw the clerk standing alone in the circle of torchlight. The man looked small, diminished, the quill still clutched in his hand like a weapon he had no strength to wield. He was staring at the carriage, his mouth open as if to speak again, but no sound came. The light from the torches flickered across his face, casting deep shadows under his eyes, making him look like a ghost already haunting the place where he stood. Gascoyne turned his head away. He could not watch the man any longer. He could not bear the accusation in that silent, open-mouthed stare. He reached for the cane leaning against the seat and tapped sharply on the roof. "Home," he called out, his voice muffled by the thick glass and the heavy curtains. "Drive on." Carriage lurched forward, the wheels crunching over the frozen ruts of the street. The movement threw him back against the squabs, and he closed his eyes, letting the rhythmic swaying of the vehicle rock him into a state of numb detachment. Outside, the noise of the crowd swelled as the carriage passed, a wave of sound that crashed against the panels and rolled away again. They were shouting names. "Squires, witch, hang her." The words were indistinct, blurred by the distance and the thick glass, but the intent was clear. The hunger was still there, raw and insatiable. He pressed his hand against the window pane. The glass was cold, so cold it burned his skin. On the other side, the world was burning with fury, with certainty, with the terrible, blazing clarity of a mob that knew exactly who was guilty and who was not. Inside, in the dark, there was only the cold, and the stain on his hand, and the scratching sound of the quill that echoed in his skull, louder than the wheels, louder than the crowd, louder than his own heartbeat. He had saved the city, he had upheld the law, he had done his duty. And he had never felt more like a murderer. The carriage turned the corner, the wheels slipping slightly on the ice, and the light from the Old Bailey faded, swallowed by the shadows of the narrow street. Gascoyne refused to glance over his shoulder. He kept his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead, waiting for the journey to end, knowing that when it did, there would be no peace waiting for him in the silence of his study. Only the ink, only the stain, only the long, cold night ahead. A stone struck the leaded pane with a wet crack, spidering the glass just above Gascoyne's left ear. He did not flinch. To flinch was to acknowledge the mob outside as a participant in the proceedings, and he could not afford to grant them such standing. The sound of shattering grit against the leaded panes had become the percussion section of his days, a relentless drumming that drowned out the finer points of legal precedent. Outside, the roar was a physical thing, a wall of heat and noise pressing against the brickwork, demanding blood for the maid, death for the gypsy. "More paper," Gascoyne said. His voice emerged as a dry rattle, stripped of the authority required to command a room, let alone a city. He kept his eyes fixed on the blotter before him, where a single drop of ink had swollen into a dark, bleeding eye. The clerk scrambled forward, the rustle of his coat loud in the sudden, terrible quiet of the chamber. Papers slid across the mahogany desk, bringing with them the smell of fresh pulp and the sharp, metallic tang of the iron gall ink that stained Gascoyne's fingers to the knuckle. The man's hands trembled. A fine vibration ran through the quill he offered, transferring itself to Gascoyne's own grip the moment their skin brushed. "My lord," the clerk whispered, leaning in so close that Gascoyne could smell the sour milk on his breath. "The aldermen from Aldgate are at the door. They say if you do not confirm the sentence within the hour, they cannot answer for the gates." "Let them answer for the gates then." Gascoyne took the quill. The feather felt greasy, slick with the sweat of his own palm. "We are not trying a case in the street. We are trying it here, or have we forgotten the difference?" "The difference is lost on them, sir. Though they hold Virtue Hall's recantation in their hands, they call it a trick, insisting she was coerced by Squire's kin. The mood has turned ugly. It is ugly beyond reason." Gascoyne dipped the nib. The ink welled up, black and viscous, catching the light from the dying fire. He looked at the document spread before him. It was the reprieve, a single sheet of parchment that stood between Mary Squires and the drop at Tyburn. To sign, it was to invite the stones through the window, to turn the city's fury from the accused gypsy woman directly onto the shoulders of the Lord Mayor. It was to admit that the great machine of justice, greased by Fielding's pamphlets and the public's hunger for a villain, had been fed a lie. He thought of Fielding. The man would be at Bow Street now, penning another broadside, certain in his genius, certain that the shivering maid was the victim and the itinerant dealer a monster. Fielding saw the world in chapters, with clear beginnings and moral endings. Gascoyne saw only the grey sludge in between, the place where truth drowned because it lacked a loud enough voice. "My lord," the clerk hovered, a shadow waiting to be cast. "The cart waits. The hangman sharpens his knife on the whetstone in the yard. I heard it myself. Scrape, scrape, like a rat gnawing bone." "Stop," Gascoyne snapped. The word cracked like a pistol shot, startling the clerk into a stumble. "Do not speak to me of hangmen. Do not speak to me of rats." He looked down at the paper again. The words swam before his eyes, the formal legalese blurring into a meaningless dance of loops and crosses. Reprieve granted. The letters seemed to mock him. If he signed, he saved a life he believed innocent, but he shattered the peace of the city. If he withheld, he kept the order Fielding demanded, but he sent a woman to the gallows on the word of a liar. The wind outside howled, rattling the sashes, shaking the dust from the cornices. Another stone hit, higher this time, followed by a cheer that rose and fell like a tide. They wanted a spectacle. They wanted the gypsy dancing on the end of a rope. Gascoyne adjusted his wig. The horsehair scratched against his neck, an itch he could not reach, a constant reminder of the burden he wore. He took a deep breath, the air tasting of coal smoke and the damp wool of his own coat. His gout throbbed in his ankle, a dull, rhythmic ache that matched the beating of his own heart. "Give me the seal," he said. The clerk fumbled with the wax pot, nearly knocking it over. Red wax spilled onto the desk, hot and smelling of tallow. Gascoyne ignored it. He pressed the signet ring into the soft pool, feeling the resistance of the wax, then the sudden give as the metal sank deep. He held it there for a count of 3, letting the heat transfer from the wax to the gold, burning his finger. When he lifted the ring, the impression remained. The arms of the City of London, stark and white against the red. A mark of authority, a mark of guilt. "It is done," Gascoyne said. His voice was barely audible now, a ghost of sound in the large, cold room. "Take it. Run, do not walk. Ensure it reaches the sheriff before the cart moves. If they have already turned the corner, you ride after them. You hear me? You ride until your horse drops." "And the aldermen, my lord, the crowd." Gascoyne stood up. The motion sent a lance of pain through his leg, forcing him to grip the edge of the desk until his knuckles turned the color of old bone. He straightened his coat, smoothing the black broadcloth over his stomach. He looked at the window, at the fractured glass where the stone had struck. Through the crack, the grey sky of February pressed in, colorless and indifferent. "Let them come," he said. "Let them break the glass. Let them break the doors, but she does not hang today." The clerk bowed, a jerky, frightened motion, and snatched the parchment from the desk. He rushed to the door, his boots clattering on the floorboards, and vanished into the corridor, leaving Gascoyne alone with the silence that rushed in to fill the space. The room felt suddenly vast, emptied of purpose now that the decision was made. The fire in the grate had burned down to a bed of grey ash, the flames extinguished, leaving only the faint glow of embers that pulsed like a dying heart. Gascoyne walked to the window. He ignored the jagged shards of glass, leaning forward until the cold draft washed over his face, stinging his eyes. Below in the yard, the crowd was a seething mass of hats and upturned faces, a single organism with 1,000 mouths screaming for blood. They did not know yet. They did not know that the rope would hang slack, that the drama they had paid for with their anger was cancelled. Soon they would know. Soon the roar would turn into a scream of betrayal, and the stones would fly thicker, harder, aimed not at a gypsy woman in a cart, but at the Lord Mayor in his high window. He watched his own reflection in the dirty glass. The face staring back was pale, the flesh sagging around the mouth, the eyes watery and red-rimmed. A stranger, a man who had chosen the harder path and found no glory in it. Behind him, the long shadow of the window frame stretched across the floorboards, cutting the room in two. It reached out towards his feet, dark and elongated by the low winter sun. Gascoyne looked down. The shadow of the gallows, imaginary yet heavier than stone, seemed to rise from the floor, merging with his own silhouette until he could no longer tell where the wood of the bench ended and his own body began. He stood there, frozen in the crossroads of light and dark, waiting for the crash of the doors, waiting for the price of justice to come due. Gascoyne did not answer the question immediately. The query hung in the air, suspended like dust motes in the single shaft of grey light that pierced the gloom of the study. Outside, the roar intensified, a physical pressure against the glass that made the panes rattle in their lead frames. A stone struck, sharp and sudden, followed by the dull thud of another impact lower down, against the wood of the shutters. They were testing the defenses, probing for weakness. He reached for the quill. The feather was stiff, the nib worn from previous use. He dipped it into the inkwell, the black liquid swallowing the point with a slow, viscous greed. When he lifted it, a single drop clung to the metal, trembling, threatening to fall and stain the blotter. He wiped it on the rim, controlled, precise. The same precision required of the words he was about to commit to paper. "My lord," the clerk shifted his weight, and the floorboard creaked with a dry, protesting sound. "The sheriff will not wait much longer, for the cart is already at the gate." "Let him wait." Gascoyne's voice was low, gravelly, stripped of any ornament. He pressed the nib to the paper. The scratch of the metal against the fiber was loud in the quiet room, a harsh counterpoint to the muffled fury beyond the walls. Reprieve granted, the letters formed slowly, each curve of the R, each cross of the T requiring a deliberate exertion of will. His hand shook, not from age, but from the sheer magnitude of the treason he was committing against the public mood. He paused, the ink pooled at the end of the sentence, a dark eye staring back at him. "You understand what this purchases," Gascoyne said. His gaze remained fixed on the wet ink, watching it settle into the paper, binding him to the act. "It purchases her life, and it purchases my ruin. There may be a way to frame it, sir, a delay, a technicality." The clerk's voice was hopeful, desperate. "We could cite the weather, claiming the roads to Tyburn are impassable." "No," Gascoyne drew a long line through the air, finishing the word squires. The flourish was jagged, unlike his usual hand. "No technicalities, no cowardice hidden in procedure. If I save her openly. Let them know whose hand stayed the rope." He dipped the quill again. The ink was cooling, thickening. He had to press harder now, the nib digging into the paper, leaving an impression on the sheet beneath. He could feel the eyes of the city on his back, though he sat alone with the clerk. He could feel Fielding's disappointment, a cold weight in his gut heavier than the gout in his ankle. Fielding would call this madness. Fielding would call this a betrayal of the peace. Fielding was not here, sitting in the draught of a window that might shatter at any moment. The mob does not distinguish between law and mercy, the clerk muttered. He was wringing his hands now, the linen of his cuffs twisting into a knot. They will see only weakness. They will see a magistrate who fears them. Perhaps I do. Gascoyne lifted the quill. He held it over the paper, the tip hovering above the space where the date should go. Or perhaps I fear the gallows more than I fear the stones. There is a difference. He wrote the date, February 1753. The numbers were small, cramped. He set the quill down. The wood felt warm from his grip. He leaned back in the chair, the leather sighing under his weight. His leg throbbed, a sharp, biting pain that shot up to his knee. He ignored it. The pain was honest. It was a reminder that he was still flesh, still capable of feeling something other than the abstract weight of the law. Outside, a cheer went up. It was not a cheer of joy, but of anticipation. They smelled blood. They smelled the end of the spectacle. They did not know that the script had changed. They did not know that the protagonist was no longer the gypsy woman in the cart, but the man sitting at the desk within the gilded cage of the mayor's office. "Will you send for the guard?" the clerk asked, having moved closer to the door with his hand resting on the latch. "To protect the carriage." "Protect the carriage?" Gascoyne laughed, a dry and brittle sound utterly devoid of humor. "There is no carriage, there is only the reprieve. Take this to the sheriff and tell him to read it aloud before the crowd, to stand upon the step and shout it until his voice breaks. And if they stone him, then he bleeds for the law." As Gascoyne pushed the paper across the desk, it slid over the wood and left a faint trail of ink dust. "And if they stone me, I bleed for it too. Yet she does not hang, not on my warrant nor on my conscience." The clerk looked at the paper, then at the door and finally at Gascoyne. For a moment, the silence stretched, tight as a drumskin. Then he nodded, a jerky, reluctant motion before he reached for the document. "It will be done, my lord." "Wait," Gascoyne held up a hand. The gesture was sharp, commanding. The clerk froze. "The seal, I must seal it. Without the wax, it is merely scrap." The clerk hesitated. He looked at the wax pot on the corner of the desk, the flame beneath it guttering in the draught. He moved to it, lifting the pot with a cloth to protect his fingers. The wax was red, dark as fresh blood. He poured it onto the paper, a pool of molten certainty. Gascoyne reached for his ring, the signet cold against his skin and heavy with metal. He pressed it into the wax and held it there. Heat radiated through the gold, burning his finger with a small, sharp pain that anchored him to the moment. He counted 1, 2, 3. He lifted the ring. The impression remained, the arms of the city of London, stark, white, final. "It is done," Gascoyne said. The words hung in the air, heavier than the smoke from the candle. He looked at the clerk. He looked at the door. He looked at the window, where the grey light was fading, giving way to the early twilight of a London winter. The stones would come now. The cheers would turn to screams. The fame he had cultivated, the respect he had earned, the peace he had sought, all of it was forfeit. He had traded it for a woman he did not know, a woman the city despised, a woman who might well be guilty for all the certainty he possessed. But she would breathe another day. "Go," he said. His voice was barely a whisper now. "Before I change my mind." The clerk snatched the parchment. He did not bow. He did not speak. He turned and fled, the door slamming shut behind him, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the empty room. Gascoyne sat alone. The fire had burned down. The wax was hardening. The shadow of the window frame stretched across the floor, long and dark, reaching for his feet. He did not move. He watched the shadow grow minute by minute as the sun dipped below the roofs of the city. He waited for the crash. He waited for the price. The door latch clicked, a final small sound swallowed by the vast, hollow throat of the marble foyer. Gascoyne did not move. He sat with his hands flat on the desk, palms pressing into the cold grain of the oak, as if anchoring himself against a tide that had already receded. The room smelled of extinguished tallow and the sharp, acrid tang of the sealing wax, a scent that clung to the back of the throat like smoke from a chimney fire. Outside, the anticipation had curdled. The cheer he had heard moments before fractured, splintering into a confused murmur that rose and fell like a wind changing direction. They knew. Someone had seen the clerk running. Someone had spotted the red wax. The script had changed, and the audience was rewriting the ending in real time. A stone struck the glass. It was not a heavy blow, just a sharp tap, like a knuckle rapping for admission. Then another, and another. The rhythm accelerated, becoming a hail of pebbles and cobblestone chippings battering the pane. Gascoyne flinched, his shoulders hunching instinctively towards his ears, but he did not turn his head. He kept his gaze fixed on the desk, on the blotter where the quill lay discarded, its feather still trembling from the force of his last stroke. Let them throw. The pain in his gouty ankle flared again, a hot, throbbing pulse that seemed to beat in time with the impacts on the window. He shifted his leg, trying to find a position that eased the pressure, but the joint was swollen, rigid, a knot of inflammation that refused to yield. He gripped the edge of the desk, his knuckles whitening. The physical agony was a comfort. It was singular. It was honest. Unlike the morality of what he had just done, which felt slippery, undefined, a thing that might dissolve if he looked at it too closely. He had signed it. The thought arrived not as a sentence, but as a physical weight settling on his chest. He had signed the reprieve for Mary Squires. He had taken the rope from her neck and placed it around his own. Fielding would never forgive him. The corporation would whisper behind their hands in the Guildhall, calling him weak, calling him a traitor to the peace of the city. The mob outside was already screaming his name, twisting it into something ugly, something unrecognizable. Coward. The word pierced the thick glass, muffled but distinct. Then, traitor. Gascoyne closed his eyes. He saw the face of the gypsy woman, not as she appeared in the docker, haggard, terrified, stripped of dignity, but as she might look in a Dorset lane, walking free, breathing air that did not taste of Newgate damp. He did not know her. He knew nothing of her soul, her sins, her truths. He knew only the gap in the evidence, the yawning chasm where proof should have been, and the terrible, suffocating certainty that if he let her hang, he would be hanging a ghost. Another stone hit the window. This one cracked the pane. A spiderweb fracture bloomed in the corner, distorting the grey light filtering into the room. A draught slipped through the gap, carrying the scent of the street, wet wool, unwashed bodies, the metallic tang of anger. It curled around his ankles, cold and invasive. He should call for the guard. He should ring the bell and summon the watchman to clear the steps, to protect the dignity of the mayor's office. But he did not reach for the bell pull. His hand remained on the desk, fingers tracing the grain of the wood, following the dark lines that ran like veins through the oak. Let them scream. If he brought the guard, he admitted fear. If he barred the doors, he acknowledged that the law was something that needed protecting from the people it served. No, he would sit here. He would take the noise. He would let the stones rattle the frames until his teeth ached. It was the penance. It was the price of the ink still wet on the parchment, now speeding towards the sheriff. A shout rose above the din, a voice amplified by a makeshift trumpet of cupped hands. Gascoyne, come out and face us. He did not move. Inside, the silence of the room was absolute, a vacuum that sucked the sound from the air. The candle on the desk had burned low, the wick drowning in a pool of its own fat. The flame guttered, shrinking, then flared briefly before settling into a dim, blue-tinged glow. Shadows lengthened across the floorboards, stretching out from the legs of the desk, from the high-backed chair, from Gascoyne's own hunched form. He watched them grow. The shadow of the window frame, distorted by the crack in the glass, stretched across the room like a bar of iron. It reached for his feet, climbing up his legs, swallowing the black broadcloth of his breeches. It was dark, featureless, a void that erased the detail of the room, the texture of the carpet, the solidity of the furniture. Gascoyne stared at it. In the dim light, the shadow seemed to detach itself from the objects that cast it. It became a thing apart, a living entity that moved with a slow, deliberate grace. It crept up the wall behind him, merging with the shadows of the bookshelves, the fireplace, the door. It filled the corners of the room, pooling in the recesses where the light could not reach. He felt a strange detachment, as if he were watching the scene from a distance, from the gallery above, looking down at the small, pale man sitting at the desk. That man was afraid. That man was trembling. That man had just sacrificed his reputation, his peace, perhaps his safety, for a principle he could not even articulate to himself. Why? The question hung in the air, unanswered. Was it courage, or was it merely the same paralysis that had haunted him since the first unjust hanging, the fear of the finality of the rope? He had told the clerk he feared the gallows more than the stones. It was true, but it was not the whole truth. He feared the silence that would follow the drop, the silence of a life extinguished by his signature. He could live with the noise of the mob. He could live with the hatred of Fielding. He could not live with the silence of a dead woman whose guilt was a shadow, not a substance. The shadow on the floor reached his knees. It climbed higher, engulfing his lap, his chest. It felt cold, though he knew it was only the absence of light. He did not shrink from it. He sat still, letting it wash over him, letting it claim him. Outside, the screaming had changed tone. The anger was still there, but beneath it ran a current of confusion, of uncertainty. They did not know what to do now. The spectacle had been denied them. The blood they had craved would not be spilled today. They were a beast with no prey, thrashing in the streets, looking for a new target. They would find one, eventually. Perhaps it would be him. Perhaps it would be Virtue Hall, cowering in some safe house, waiting for the next twist of the knife. Perhaps it would be Elizabeth Canning herself, whose story was beginning to unravel like a poorly stitched seam. But not today. Today, Mary Squires would breathe. Gascoyne exhaled, a long, shuddering breath that seemed to empty his lungs completely. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk, burying his face in his hands. The skin of his palms was cool, damp with sweat. He rubbed his eyes, trying to wipe away the image of the gallows, the rope, the cart rolling away from the prison gates. It did not work. The image was burned into his mind, etched there by the same ink that had signed the reprieve. It would stay there. It would stay there long after the mob had dispersed, long after the newspapers had printed their verdicts, long after Fielding had written his pamphlets, and the city had moved on to the next scandal, the next fever. He would carry it. The shadow on the floor had reached the wall behind the desk. It merged with the darkness of the room, becoming indistinguishable from the gloom. Gascoyne lifted his head. He looked at the place where the shadow of the gallows should have been, cast by a structure that stood miles away in Tyburn. He could not see it, of course. The sun was setting, the angle was wrong, but he felt it. He felt its weight, its presence, stretching across the city, reaching into this room, wrapping around his ankles like a chain. It was not just a shadow of wood and rope. It was a shadow of the law itself, of the terrible, necessary machinery that ground men and women into dust in the name of order. He had oiled the gears today. He had stopped them, just for a moment, just for one life. But the machine would start again tomorrow. It would always start again. And he would be sitting here, at this desk, watching the shadows lengthen, waiting for the next name to be called. A heavy thud against the door made him jump, and though his first thought was a stone, it was a fist instead, someone trying to break in. Gascoyne did not flinch this time. He straightened his spine, adjusting his wig with a trembling hand, smoothing the heavy black broadcloth of his coat. He picked up the cold quill and set it neatly in the stand. He folded his hands on the desk, interlacing his fingers, hiding the tremor. "Come in," he said. His voice was steady. It sounded like the voice of a magistrate. It sounded like the voice of a man who knew exactly what he had done and why. The door handle turned. Heat pressed against the high windows of the justice room, trapping the scent of unwashed wool and summer dust inside the brick box. September air hung heavy, thick with the fly-blown sweetness of the river nearby, a stark contradiction to the biting frost that had gripped the city when last he saw this girl stand upon these same floorboards. Gascoyne shifted his weight on the bench, the gout in his left ankle flaring a sharp, familiar warning as he adjusted the heavy black broadcloth of his robe. He did not look at the crowd, he looked at the dock. Elizabeth Canning stood there, not the emaciated creature of January who had shivered in rags and claimed a hayloft in Enfield. This woman wore a clean mob cap and a gown of decent brown stuff, her cheeks filled out with the meat of prison fare and the attention of patrons. She held her chin up, defiant, or perhaps merely tired. The scratch of quills on paper dominated the room, a dry insect noise that filled the spaces between the murmurs of the clerks. Gascoyne reached for his spectacles, the silver hinges cool against his thumb, and began to clean the lenses with a handkerchief already spotless. He folded the linen, unfolded it, rubbed the glass again. "The charge is perjury, my lord." The clerk stood at his elbow, a stack of warrants bound in red tape resting against his hip. The man smelled of ink and damp parchment. "I am aware of the charge," Gascoyne replied. His voice came out low, gravelly, forcing the clerk to lean in close enough to catch the words. "Is the indictment drawn?" "Finalized this morning, Sir Crisp." "And the witness statements from Dorset?" "Filed contradictory to her original timeline." The clerk paused, shifting the weight of the papers. "Fielding is in the gallery. He watches you." Gascoyne stopped cleaning the spectacles. He lowered the handkerchief to the desk, smoothing the linen flat with a palm that trembled slightly before he clenched it into a fist. He did not turn to look at the gallery. He knew where Fielding sat. He knew the intensity of that gaze, the intellectual arrogance that demanded a conviction now just as it had demanded one then. The pendulum swung. Blood required either way. "Let him watch. It may provoke them, my lord, the Canningites." "Let them provoke." Gascoyne lifted his eyes to the dock again. Canning was speaking to her counsel, her hands moving in sharp, truncated gestures. She did not look afraid. She looked like a woman who had learned that survival required a hard shell, that truth was merely a tool to be picked up or discarded depending on which way the wind blew. She claimed confinement. She claimed starvation. Now she claims she spoke only what others wished to hear. "Virtue Hall recanted first," the clerk murmured. "That broke the spine of it." Hall feared the noose more than she loved the truth. Gascoyne picked up the quill. The nib hovered over the commitment warrant, the ink still wet where the clerk had dated it. September 1753, 7 months since the ice had cracked on the Thames, 7 months since he had signed the reprieve for Mary Squires and felt the mob's stones rattle against the mansion house windows. Squires was free, transporting, perhaps, or vanished into the countryside, alive. That was the only metric that mattered. The law was satisfied. His conscience remained an open wound. He signed the paper. The scratch of the nib sounded loud in the sudden lull of the room. "Take her down," Gascoyne said. The bailiffs moved forward, their boots clumping on the wood. Canning did not resist. She stepped out of the dock with a strange dignity, her eyes scanning the room until they landed on him. For a second, their gazes locked. There was no plea there, no apology, just a flat, hard recognition of the machinery that ground them both. She looked away first. The crowd in the gallery began to shift, a rustling of skirts and coats as the verdict settled into the collective mind. Some cheered, some hissed. The sound washed over Gascoyne without touching him. He felt nothing, no triumph, no relief, only a deep, hollow exhaustion that settled into his bones like the damp of the river itself. He stood up. The movement sent a spike of pain through his ankle, forcing him to grip the edge of the bench until the wave passed. He waited for the room to quiet, but the noise continued, a low roar of debate and anger that would follow him out into the street. "My lord," the clerk gathered the papers, stacking them into a precise pile. "The carriage is waiting." "Have them bring it to the side door." Gascoyne adjusted his wig, feeling the weight of the horsehair press against his neck. It chafed, everything chafed today. "I will not process through the crowd. It may be noted as cowardice." "Let it be noted." Gascoyne turned from the bench, his cane tapping a sharp rhythm against the floorboards. Click, drag, click. He walked towards the antechamber, leaving the noise of the court behind him. The air in the corridor was cooler, smelling of stone and old smoke. He paused there, leaning against the wall, closing his eyes for a moment to steady his breathing. The reversal was complete, and though Canning would transport while Squires lived so that justice, of a sort, had been done, the taste in his mouth remained sour like copper left on the tongue. He opened his eyes to look at the door leading to the street, beyond which lay the city with its coffee houses and pamphlets, Fielding's inevitable rebuttal, and the mob's shifting fury. They would need a new target now. Perhaps him, or perhaps the clerk, or maybe the next poor soul dragged before the bench, with a story too convenient to be true. He pushed off the wall. The cane struck the floor again. "Move," he said to the footman waiting by the door. The man scrambled to open it. Light flooded the corridor, bright and unforgiving. Gascoyne stepped into it, squinting against the glare, knowing the shadow would follow him home. The study door latched, with a click that sounded too final, like a bone snapping in a quiet room. Gascoyne did not light the candles. The grey light of a September afternoon seeped through the leaded panes, thick with the soot of 1,000 coal fires, casting the room in a bruised twilight that matched the ache behind his eyes. He moved to the desk, the heavy oak groaning under the weight of ledgers and the single sheet of parchment that mattered. The transportation order, dry now. The ink had lost its sheen, settling into the fibre of the paper like a stain that would never wash out. He sat, the leather chair creaked, a familiar complaint from a familiar burden. His hand hovered over the document, trembling, not from age, though the gout in his ankle throbbed a dull, rhythmic warning against the leg of the desk, but from a fatigue that went deeper than bone. He extended a finger, the tip calloused from years of gripping quills and cane handles, and traced the loop of the G in his own signature. Crisp Gascoyne. The letters looked foreign, disjointed, as if written by a stranger trying to mimic a magistrate's hand while the room spun. 7 months, he whispered. The words hung in the cold air, dissolving before they could find purchase. Outside, the city roared. Even here, within the high-walled refuge of the Canning family home, the noise penetrated. The distant clatter of cart wheels on cobblestones, the shouting of hawkers selling mackerel or coal, the low, constant hum of a population that refused to be silenced. They were celebrating, perhaps, or mourning. It made no difference. The mob was a single beast with 1,000 heads, and it had simply turned its gaze from Mary Squires to Elizabeth Canning, hungry as ever. He pulled the drawer open to find the other warrant lying inside, the one from January that served as the reprieve for the gypsy woman. He drew it out. The paper was softer now, worn from handling. He had taken it from the fold a dozen times since the verdict, smoothing the creases, checking the date, verifying the seal. As if doubt could be erased by repetition. As if looking at the words would change the outcome or confirm that he had not dreamt the whole feverish winter. Susanna Wells, Mary Squires. Names that had become slogans, battle cries. He laid the January warrant beside the September order, 2 sheets of paper, 2 lives balanced on the edge of a knife, one saved from the gallows by his hesitation, the other condemned to the colonies by his certainty. The irony tasted bitter, sharp as vinegar on the back of the tongue. He had wanted order. He had wanted the streets quiet, the factions silenced, the dignity of the corporation intact. He had wanted to be the man who steadied the ship while the storm broke. Instead, he was the man who had signed both papers. A draft slipped through the window frame, carrying the smell of the river. Low tide, mud, rotting seaweed, the metallic tang of industry. The Thames was moving again. The great thaw had come weeks ago, breaking the ice that had choked the waterway since Christmas, releasing the trapped barges and the filth beneath. The city was fluid now, messy, alive. But inside this room, the air remained frozen. He picked up the quill again, not to write, but just to hold something solid, and as the feather brushed his thumb, it felt soft and brittle. Did I save her? He asked the empty room, or did I just delay the ending? There was no answer, only the scratching of a rat behind the wainscoting, a tiny, frantic sound that mirrored the jittering of his own nerves. He remembered Squires in the dock, the way she had stared at him, not with hatred, but with a terrifying, blank acceptance. She had known the rope was around her neck before he had even lifted the pen. She had known the law was a game played by men who feared the crowd more than they feared God, and he had been the most afraid of all. Fielding would write about this. Of course he would. A pamphlet by next week, dense with rhetoric, justifying the turnaround, praising the swift correction of justice, glossing over the 7 months of torment. Fielding saw the narrative arc, the moral lesson, the triumph of truth. He did not see the tremor in the hand that signed the warrant. He did not see the sleepless nights where the face of the accused floated in the dark, asking questions that had no legal answers. Gascoyne folded the January warrant, slowly and precisely, aligning the edges until they were perfect. He placed it back in the drawer on top of the blank sheets and pushed it shut. The wood clicked. Gone. But not gone. He looked at the transportation order again, where Canning's name stared back at him. Elizabeth Canning, the maidservant, the liar, the victim, the fraud, all of them, none of them. She was just a girl who had told a story too good to be true, and a city that had wanted to believe it so badly They had nearly killed an innocent woman to make it real. Now she would go to America to work, to survive, maybe to die there far from the stones of Aldermanbury. Was that justice? The question sat in his chest, heavy and cold. It offered no comfort, no resolution, just a hollow space where his pride used to be. He reached for the candlestick on the corner of the desk, where the tallow was half melted, a pool of white grease hardening around the base. When he struck the flint, a spark flew, followed by a wisp of smoke and then flame. The light jumped, casting long, dancing shadows against the bookshelves until the faces of the law books seemed to lean forward, judging him in the flicker. He watched the flame for a moment. It wavered in the draught, struggling to stay upright. "Let it be ambiguous," he murmured. "Let them argue over the bones." He did not want a monument, no statue in the Guildhall, no plaque praising his wisdom. Let his name fade into the footnotes of the corporation records, a line item in a ledger of mayors who had served their term and died. Let the history books squabble over whether he was a coward or a savior. Let Fielding have the glory of the narrative. Gascoyne wanted only the silence, the quiet of a room where no one demanded blood. He blew out the candle. Darkness rushed in, instant and absolute. The grey light from the window was gone, swallowed by the early evening. The room vanished. The desk, the papers, the trembling hander all erased. Only the sound of his own breathing remained, shallow and ragged in the blackness. Somewhere out there, the Thames flowed on, dark and indifferent, carrying the refuse of the city out to sea. The ice was broken, the water moved, but the cold remained. It was in the walls, in the floorboards, in the marrow of his legs. It would not leave. He sat still in the dark, listening to the city breathe, knowing that the shadow of this trial would stretch longer than his life, reaching out to touch every verdict he ever gave, every soul he ever judged. The absolution was cold, and it was his. The Alderman's shadow is a work of fiction. Its characters and scenes are invented, but the story is grounded in real events, places, and the social conditions of its period, dramatized, not documented. The history behind it draws on these real sources. Elizabeth Canning. Disappearance of Dylan Ayler. Researched via Wikipedia and contemporary records. Liberties taken with the timeline or with real persons are the author's own.